There is an old Ethiopian book that refuses to leave the Ark of the Covenant, lost in mist. It gives the Ark a road, a lineage, a guarded destination, and a royal memory. In the Kebra Nagast, the path to Ethiopia does not begin with thieves in the dark. It begins with a queen who hears that in Jerusalem there is a king whose wisdom sounds like light entering a locked room. If the title of this video promises Ethiopia's secret record of the Ark's true location, this is where that promise first opens, because before the holy chest is carried south, a heart is turned, a house is joined, and a future heir is marked inside a story that Ethiopia kept alive in Gay's memory. If you love slow Bible mysteries, ancient royal legends, and night journeys through old sacred texts, subscribe now and stay with me. I am Pastor Michael, and I want to begin not with an argument, but with a return. Imagine the southern roads after trade season. The air is still warm from the day, but evening has started to lower itself across the high country. Dust settles on pack animals. Brass catches the last thin light. Servants loosen straps. Porters count jars, bundles, and ivory pieces. Men who have crossed water and desert carry the smell of distant ports on their clothing. And at the center of that returning movement stands a merchant whose tongue has become dangerous because it is full of another kingdom. His name, in the Ethiopian telling, is Tamrin. He has gone north. He has seen Jerusalem. He has stood under the order of a court unlike any he knew before. He has watched cedar beams set where kings had not set them before. He has heard judgments given with a calm that made strong men silent. He has seen a ruler whose fame traveled farther than gold. And when he returns to the court of Makeda, he does not speak first about trade margins or caravan losses or the moods of the sea. He speaks about Solomon. That matters. It matters because merchants normally bring measures, prices, routes, and warnings. They return with information that helps a kingdom stand a little longer, bargain a little better, defend its borders a little more wisely. But Tamrin comes back carrying something less practical and more unsettling. He carries testimony. He does not merely report that Jerusalem is rich. He says its king is unlike other kings. He says this man has been given discernment that feels beyond tutoring. He says this ruler speaks with unusual command about justice, about the ordering of a people, about the making of a sanctuary, about the God of Israel, and even, in the richly embroidered style of the Ethiopian tradition, about birds and beasts and the hidden logic of created things. A court can hear news of wealth and remain composed. A court can hear of military force and begin planning. But when a court hears that another throne possesses wisdom so clear that it rearranges the scale by which greatness is measured, curiosity becomes harder to govern. So, let us enter the Queen's hearing room gently. She is not presented in this tradition as a timid figure wandering toward male brilliance. She is already a sovereign. She is already accustomed to tribute, counsel, distance, and ceremony. In Ethiopian memory, she is Makeda, and the story gives her not foolish fascination, but appetite for understanding. That is one of the first noble things the narrative lets her keep. She is not conquered by gossip. She is moved by the possibility that what she has heard might be true. And this is where the story begins to feel strangely alive, even in the middle of the night, because the first deep motion is not romance. It is hunger of the mind. The Ethiopian epic gives her a line of desire more honorable than greed. She values wisdom above treasure. She wants to hear with her own ears. She wants to test what has reached her by rumor. She wants to know whether there really is, in Jerusalem, a man whose rule is shaped by a God she does not yet fully know. There are stories in which people travel because they are ambitious. There are stories in which people travel because they are desperate. And there are stories in which people travel because they have sensed that truth may be waiting somewhere beyond the horizon they already command. This is that kind of journey. The old account lets the queen listen. It lets the merchant speak. It lets report become invitation. And in that interval, before a single camel kneels for loading, the title promise of this video grows clearer. Ethiopia's secret record about the Ark is not framed as a late guess about a missing object. It is framed as a royal memory whose roots go back to a meeting between thrones. The future resting place of the Ark is tied, in this tradition, to a chain of events that begins in desire for wisdom. Before there is transfer, there is encounter. Before there is custody, there is covenantal attraction. Before the road turns toward the mystery of Zion, someone in the south decides that hearing the truth matters more than remaining impressive at home. That is one reason the opening deserves to be told slowly. I want you to feel the dignity of a queen who does not send only delegates. She goes herself. The decision would have been costly. Caravans are statements. Every loaded animal declares power, but also vulnerability. To travel with abundance is to announce that you trust your route, your escorts, your provisions, and your own ability to appear in another sovereign city without losing face. Gifts must be worthy. Language must be prepared. Questions must be carried carefully. One does not arrive before Solomon with thin offerings and casual speech. So the preparations begin. Gold is selected. Precious stones are brought out. Servants inspect fabrics. Animals are counted and recounted. Water skins are judged not by hope, but by endurance. The long road north asks everyone the same question. How badly do you want what waits at the end of it? And underneath the visible labor, there is another preparation that no steward can inventory. The queen is arranging herself inwardly for an encounter that may change her measure of the world. That inward readiness is easy to miss if we rush past the old narrative as if it were merely exotic scenery. But the spiritual pressure of the opening rests right there. Makeda is not simply leaving one court for another. She is walking out of one understanding of glory and toward another. In many retellings of the Queen of Sheba, the emphasis falls on riddles, luxury, spectacle. The Ethiopian version certainly enjoys grandeur, but it also keeps turning the light toward recognition. What happens when a ruler accustomed to being admired goes to meet someone else whose gift may expose the thinness of ordinary greatness? That is a searching question. It troubles pride. It also purifies desire. The old witness does not make the queen small. It makes her teachable. And there is something noble in that which modern ears can still hear without forcing it into therapy language or soft inspiration. Teachability is not weakness. In sacred stories, it is often the doorway through which history changes shape. A closed ruler protects reputation. An open ruler may lose certainty, but gain truth. So the word about Solomon does its work. It ripens. It disturbs sleep. It follows the queen into meals, into counsel, into moments when music is playing and yet some other sound has begun inside her, the sound of a question that will not settle for second-hand answers. How wise is this king? What kind of God gives such wisdom? What sort of sanctuary is rising in Jerusalem? What does it mean for a throne to be famous, not only for force, but for ordered understanding? And perhaps beneath all of those questions, there is another one, more dangerous, because it cannot be negotiated with tribute. What if the center I have known is not the only center that exists? That is the kind of question that sends caravans across continents. Now let the scene widen. See the southern kingdom preparing to release its queen into distance. Hear the practical voices around her. Advisors discuss timing. Rootmen speak of wells. Caravan leaders judge pace by terrain, not desire. Attendants seal chests. Record keepers note gifts. The movement from courtly intention to actual departure is slow, expensive, public. Nothing about it is impulsive anymore. The report from Jerusalem has become direction. And while all of that unfolds, the Ethiopian tradition is quietly building one of its largest claims. It is not merely saying, "We have heard of Israel." It is saying, "Our royal memory enters the biblical world at the level of direct contact, chosen movement, and divinely significant consequence." The Kebra Nagast makes Ethiopia not a distant spectator, but an inheriting participant. That is why the book mattered so much in later centuries for the imagination of royal legitimacy and sacred destiny. Modern historians will treat it as a medieval Ethiopian epic shaped to serve dynastic and religious claims, and that caution must be kept in mind. Yet inside the story world itself, the narrative speaks with total confidence. It does not speculate, it remembers. That remembering voice is part of the atmosphere we need for good narration, not panic, not debate stage energy, not sensational performance, a steadier thing. A voice that says, "Sit near the fire for a while and listen to how a people told the beginning of their bond with Jerusalem. The merchant has spoken. The queen has decided. The roads are gathering themselves. Night after night, the stars pass over animals that will soon bend under royal freight. Morning after morning, handlers test harness, rope, leather, and nerve. The land between Ethiopia and Jerusalem is not erased by longing. It must be crossed step by step. Great stories still have to endure ordinary distance. That is one of the reasons I love openings like this. They refuse instant holiness. They insist on travel. The promise is high, but the road is dusty. And somewhere in those final days before departure, Makeda must have stood alone for a moment and understood that once she began, she would not return as the same woman who left. Not because travel always changes people in a deep way. Sometimes it does not. But because she was not traveling only to inspect a foreign ruler, she was going to submit rumor to sight, wisdom to testing, and perhaps even her inherited devotion to a greater name. That is how the first movement closes, not with revelation yet, but with departure forming. The queen rises from her own land under the pressure of testimony. The merchant's report has done more than decorate another king. It has opened a road that leads toward Jerusalem, toward Solomon, toward the God he names, and toward the hidden beginning of Ethiopia's most guarded claim. By the time the caravan starts north, the ark has not moved an inch, and yet, in the logic of the old book, everything necessary for its future road has already begun. The road has opened. The caravan does not move like rumor. Rumor leaps. A royal procession advances by weight, weather, patience, and command. So let the pace change here. Hear leather draw tight in the early morning. Hear the soft complaint of animals rising under burden. Hear the low call of men setting lines in order. Gold does not glitter much at dawn when it is wrapped for safety. Precious stones do not preach while packed in shadow. Everything valuable begins the journey hidden. That itself feels fitting for a story whose greatest claim will one day center on a sacred object concealed from public gaze. Makeda rides north with servants, guards, attendants, and gifts worthy of kings. The biblical memory in 1 Kings speaks of camels, spices, gold in abundance. The Ethiopian tradition receives that world and expands it with its own royal imagination. The roads carry more than commerce. They carry intention. A queen is going to test a man whose wisdom has become an international report. Day by day, the terrain changes its voice. There are stretches where the wind has room to speak. There are stretches where heat presses conversation into silence. At watering points, the caravan gathers itself like a temporary town, then scatters again into motion. Meals are brief. sleep is strategic. Even beauty must be glanced at on the move. Nothing on the route is allowed to delay purpose for long. And perhaps that is why the story gains force during travel, rather than losing it. When a ruler leaves her own courts and comforts, every mile becomes testimony that the thing sought is worth more than stability. Each hoofbeat north says the same sentence differently. Wisdom is worth the road. That line matters to the whole emotional architecture of the tale. The queen is not hunting novelty. She is not engaging in intellectual tourism. The old account gives her seriousness. She wants to know whether the reports about Solomon are true. That desire gives the journey moral weight. One may travel for spectacle and come back unchanged. One may travel for verification and find oneself overturned. The dust of the road is often where inner hierarchies start to rearrange. The sun rises and falls. The camps are made and broken, and somewhere along the route, what began as curiosity hardens into readiness. By the time Jerusalem is near, the queen has already paid enough in effort to ask her questions with authority. She has earned the right to hear clearly. Then, at last, the city appears. No matter how often a traveler has imagined arrival, the first sight still lands with its own force. Walls, gates, movement, sound, banners, guards, storerooms, courtyards, officials, servants, priests, petitioners, laborers, smoke, carved wood, worked stone. Jerusalem would have felt like convergence. In the era of Solomon, as remembered in tradition, it is not merely a capital. It is a place where kingship, worship, administration, and ambition are being gathered into one visible center. And for this story, the city matters because it holds together two things the queen has come to test: the fame of Solomon and the God from whom his wisdom is said to come. She does not enter a private study. She enters an ordered world. That is important. Wisdom in ancient texts is rarely treated as disconnected brilliance. It shows itself in households, judgments, buildings, speech, ritual, proportion, and the calm arrangement of what belongs where. If Solomon is truly wise, his city should bear that signature. His court should sound different. His rule should feel measured, not merely mighty. The Ethiopian telling delights in that impression. Solomon is not presented as one more dazzling monarch among many. He is a man touched by a gift that gathers admiration because it seems sourced beyond him. That is why the queen's testing does not reduce the encounter to witty riddles tossed across a banquet table. The challenge is broader. She is reading the whole environment. She is listening to the weight of his answers. She is measuring whether his celebrated understanding can bear scrutiny, and he receives her with honor. That too must be spoken carefully. Mutual dignity is part of the grandeur here. A lesser story would make one throne swallow the other. This one stages an encounter between majesty and majesty, then allows the difference to emerge through wisdom rather than humiliation. So let us picture the reception. The caravan is announced. Servants move with polished speed. Gifts are borne inward. Words are exchanged according to station. The queen is welcomed into a realm where attention has already gone ahead of her. Solomon knows she has come because of what she has heard. She knows, he knows. Every formal courtesy is carrying a sharper, quieter energy beneath it. Two rulers are about to discover what kind of truth can survive presence. Then the speaking begins. The Bible says she came to test him with hard questions. The Ethiopian tradition lingers inside that atmosphere of inquiry. One can almost hear the room narrow around each exchange. Not because voices are raised, but because meaning is being weighed. What does a wise ruler know? What does wisdom sound like when it answers without strain? Can greatness remain gentle? Can knowledge reveal God rather than vanity? The story wants us to believe the answer is yes. Solomon does not dazzle her by trickery. He answers, he interprets, he explains, he locates human order under divine order. He presents kingship not as private genius, but as received gift. In that sense, the meeting is not only intellectual, it is theological. Makeda has not come merely to admire a clever man. She has come into the presence of a form of wisdom that claims source in the God of Israel. That changes the temperature of the whole stay, because once wisdom is attached to God, admiration can become conversion. The Ethiopian epic is bold here. It moves beyond diplomacy into transformation. The queen hears, sees, discerns, and is drawn away from former worship. In the story's telling, she turns from the sun and toward the Lord whom Solomon serves. That movement is crucial. It means the bond between Ethiopia and Jerusalem is not simply political or genealogical. It becomes devotional. A throne in the south begins to lean toward Israel's God before the ark ever reaches Ethiopian soil. And that is one of the old book's deepest narrative strategies. It prepares later claims by planting reverence early. Ethiopia does not receive sacred prestige as loot in this vision. It is portrayed as responding to revelation. The queen is not made holy by conquest, but by recognition. Now let the days in Jerusalem lengthen. Britannica notes the Ethiopian tradition that she stayed 6 months. Whether one takes that as legend, symbolic memory, or elaborated royal lore, it serves the narration beautifully because it slows the encounter. This is not a one-afternoon exchange of riddles followed by departure. The city works on her. Solomon's words work on her. The ordered life of the court, the gravity of the temple project, the disciplined confidence of the king's speech, all of it presses upon the queen like steady rain rather than lightning. She sees the difference between display and weight. Many courts can stage splendor. Few can make splendor feel governed by meaning. That distinction is part of what the narrative wants us to taste. There would also have been the impression of sacred labor. The reports Tumreen brought back were not only about a clever king, but about a ruler building for the name of God. In the wider biblical memory, Solomon's reign is bound to the temple, and the Ethiopian telling keeps that aura of construction, offering, and ordered reverence around him. So when Makeda looked upon Jerusalem, she was not measuring one gifted speaker. She was measuring a kingdom trying to gather worship, law, kingship, and beauty into one visible testimony. That kind of sight can persuade more deeply than argument. Stone joined to cedar, gold joined to offering, administration joined to praise. Such combinations preach without announcing that they are preaching. They tell the onlooker that wisdom is not merely what a king says when challenged. Wisdom is what a king builds, permits, arranges, restrains, and dedicates. No wonder the queen's respect began to move beyond admiration for a mind and toward reverence for the God who seemed to have tutored that mind. Another feature of Jerusalem must have pressed upon her: confidence without hurry. Courts built on fear often move fast, loudly, and with constant correction. But a kingdom convinced that wisdom has been granted from above can afford measured speech. That calm would have been persuasive. It is one thing to hear that Solomon can answer riddles. It is another to watch an entire environment breathe as though order itself has taken up residence there. Servants know where to stand. Officials do not jostle for importance. The machinery of rule does not clatter. Even magnificence seems disciplined. For a queen who had crossed so much distance to judge the truth of a report, such coherence would have felt like evidence. It would have told her that wisdom is not theatrical sparkle. It is a force that settles rooms, steadies systems, and teaches power to move without panic. No wonder Jerusalem entered her, not only through the ear, but through the whole attentive body. It taught even the eye before it taught the mind. Picture her walking through halls where servants know their tasks without confusion. Picture tables where abundance does not collapse into vulgarity. Picture officials whose movement reflects an administration shaped by confidence instead of frantic correction. Picture cedar, stone, linen, incense, gold, and ordered offerings, all arranged under the conviction that rule is answerable to heaven. One need not flatten the legend into a modern historical report to feel its design. The story is building a contrast between ordinary glory and sanctified kingship. Solomon shines, yes, but he shines in relation to a God who has given him wisdom. And Makeda, for all her rank, becomes a witness to that relation. This is where Pastor Michael should lower his voice a little, because there is a tender human truth inside royal magnificence. Sometimes, the thing that changes us most is not a miracle, but coherence. To encounter a life, a house, a ruler, or a people in which things seem to stand under a higher order can be more unsettling than spectacle. Disorder expects to be impressed by noise. The soul is more deeply moved when it meets harmony. Jerusalem, in this telling, feels harmonious to her, not perfect, not stripped of earthly power, not free of the tragic ironies that later generations will know, but harmonious enough that she believes Solomon's wisdom is real. And once she believes that, the city becomes more than a destination. It becomes the hinge of her future. The queen who came to inspect is becoming the queen who receives. That is a dangerous crossing for any ruler, because reception feels like surrender to those who worship control. Yet the old epic treats her reception of wisdom as greatness, not diminishment. She grows larger by bending toward truth, so the stay ripens. Questions are answered. Thought becomes admiration. Admiration becomes trust. Trust becomes attachment, and attachment begins to deepen into something the narrative will soon render through one of its most memorable scenes. But before that night comes, hold for a moment the image of Makeda in Jerusalem at dusk. The city is quieter now. Labor has slowed. Lamps have been lit. The sounds of administration have lowered into domestic distance. Somewhere beyond visible walls, pilgrims, traders, servants, and soldiers fold themselves into evening. And in royal lodging near Solomon's house, a queen from the south sits with what she has heard. She came to test wisdom. Now wisdom has begun to test her. For if the God of Israel truly grants this understanding, what does that mean for power? For worship? For the shape of a nation? For the children of a throne not yet born? Questions no longer point only outward. They have turned inward. That is how the road into Jerusalem completes itself. Not when the caravan reaches the gate, but when the queen crosses from examination into inward change. The city has received her. Solomon has answered her. The God behind Solomon's speech has become impossible for her to ignore. And in the warm stillness before departure is discussed, another movement begins, quieter than a caravan, smaller than a court, yet heavy enough to alter the destiny of kingdoms. When stories pass through centuries, they often preserve one scene that glows more fiercely than the rest. For this part of the Kebra Nagast, it is a meal, not a battle, not a coronation, not the moving of the ark. A meal arranged by Solomon on the edge of parting. By now, the queen has heard enough, seen enough, and received enough to know that Jerusalem is not merely famous, it is formative. She has tasted a wisdom she cannot dismiss. She has turned toward the God whose name stands behind Solomon's speech. And yet the old Ethiopian story is not content to leave the bond at admiration. It presses toward lineage. The future claim of Ethiopia in this tradition will not rest only on spiritual sympathy. It will rest on blood, inheritance, and the birth of a son. So the narrative gathers itself around departure. That is the emotional weather of the scene. Departure sharpens what affection had kept in softer outlines. People can dwell for months inside admiration without naming what it has become. The prospect of leaving often forces desire to reveal its actual size. Solomon does not want this meeting to end as a beautiful interruption. The queen, for all her dignity, is not untouched, and the story, with characteristic confidence, shapes that tension into one of its most discussed episodes. A feast is prepared. The table is rich, but not innocent. The king has a plan. In the Ethiopian account, he orders the food seasoned heavily with salt and spice. The meal is designed to awaken thirst. The setting is formal, but beneath the surface, one can feel strategy moving like a current under polished wood. Solomon desires an heir through Makeda. He also desires a path by which intimacy can be taken without appearing to violate royal honor. This is where the old legend becomes morally complicated, and it is better to speak that complication plainly than to hide it under devotional fog. The story does not give us a modern romance shaped by transparent consent and balanced vulnerability. It gives us an ancient royal episode structured by oath, cunning, desire, and asymmetry. If we narrate it well, we do not need to excuse it in order to understand its importance in the logic of the tradition. So listen carefully to the arrangement. Solomon tells the queen that he will not take her by force. She, in turn, swears that she will not take anything from his house. At first, the exchange sounds like protection wrapped in courtesy. It appears to create a clean boundary. But the king has already salted the path ahead. He knows the feast will work within the body long after the dishes are cleared. Night comes. The room's quiet. Servants withdraw. The palace enters that suspended hour when great houses seem to be listening to their own stillness. And then, thirst begins its work. One can feel why the scene endured. It is intimate without being gentle, clever without being innocent, fateful without any trumpet of destiny announcing itself. A woman far from home wakes thirsty after a carefully prepared feast. Water is near. Water belongs to the king's house. The oath, which seemed to protect distance, now becomes a snare. If she drinks, she has taken what is his. If she refrains, she suffers bodily need in the middle of the night. Ancient storytellers loved such thresholds, the moment when a promise meets appetite, when language and desire collide, when a single small act changes the moral structure of the room. So she reaches for water. And Solomon, in the Ethiopian telling, is ready. He names what has happened. She has taken from his house. The terms of the oath have shifted. The boundary is broken, not by his force, but by her thirst and his design. This is not the place to prettify the scene. It is wiser to let its seriousness remain. The king's intelligence here is not the same as holiness. Sacred literature and sacred adjacent royal legend often place troubling human conduct close to destiny. The result is uncomfortable, but also revealing. The line that will matter so much to Ethiopia's later self-understanding emerges through a night that is neither pure fairy tale nor simple courtroom logic. It emerges through the dangerous mingling of longing, power, oath, and vulnerability. Yet the story refuses to leave the moment only in darkness. What follows is not portrayed as defilement ending in silence. It becomes union with consequence. Solomon gives Makeda a ring from his hand. That gesture matters immensely. In a world ordered by lineage, a token from the father becomes future-proof. If a child is born, the ring will bear witness to origin. The night is sealed not only by memory, but by sign. And because the Ethiopian tradition is always thinking ahead to dynastic destiny, the ring does more than sentimentalize parting. It creates recognition across years. A future son will not need only a story from his mother. He will carry royal evidence. Pause over that image. A ring placed into the keeping of a departing queen. Gold answering gold. A circle carrying claim. A small object preparing one of the largest assertions in Ethiopian sacred history. The ring says, "This was not a passing shadow." The ring says, "The bond can be proved." The ring says, "What was joined in hiddenness may later stand in public consequence." Morning does eventually come, because mornings always come. Even after nights that change the shape of nations, departure can no longer be delayed. The caravan that came north for wisdom must now turn south, bearing something far more difficult to classify. Not merely knowledge, not merely admiration, not merely a revised understanding of God. The queen leaves with a sign from Solomon, with memory in her body, and with a future the road itself does not yet fully reveal. The old epic lets the sadness of departure remain visible. Partings after recognition are heavier than partings after ceremony. She has not simply visited a famous king. She has entered a bond that will travel with her. Imagine the leaving, the city gates behind her, the long road ahead, the sounds of the caravan settling into southward rhythm, servants speaking in lower tones than before. The private knowledge of the queen guarded more carefully than the chests among the animals. Jerusalem begins to recede, but it does not release its claim on her life. And this is where the title promise of the whole video must be gently renewed. Ethiopia's record of the Ark's true location does not begin with map coordinates. It begins with intimacy, translated into inheritance. The future journey of the Ark, as this tradition will tell it, is made possible because a son will one day stand between Jerusalem and Ethiopia, bearing both blood and legitimacy. The ring in Makeda's keeping is one of the earliest bridges over that distance. The road south becomes a road of concealment. What is hidden now will ripen later. What is carried silently will speak through a child. What happened in a guarded royal room will one day become a national claim. The southward road is doing two kinds of work at once. Outwardly, it is nothing more than return. The same routines, the same dust, the same need to protect provisions, pace the animals, quiet disputes, and search out water. Inwardly, it has become a corridor of transformation. Makeda is carrying knowledge she cannot fully announce, longing she cannot easily unwind, and a future that will only become legible with time. Royal households are rarely free from politics, and one can imagine the care required when she came again within sight of her own realm. What should be told at once? What should be hidden until birth? Which servants could be trusted? Which counselors could hear the truth without turning it into strategy too quickly? Great legends often leave such practical questions unstated, but their silence can make the scene richer. A queen does not return from Jerusalem as a private woman. She returns as a sovereign whose body, memory, and future household now carry international consequence. And perhaps this is the right place to notice how carefully the Ethiopian imagination binds motherhood to monarchy. The child who will come from this road is not treated as an accidental appendix to a famous meeting. He will become the living hinge between two courts, two memories, and two sacred geographies. That is why the ring matters. That is why the departure matters. That is why even the silence around the queen matters. A kingdom may continue outwardly unchanged, while the most decisive alteration is still hidden in a womb, in a promise, or in a line of descent nobody else can yet see. The old story understands that history often arrives quietly first. Only later do people give it banners. So the return to Ethiopia should be imagined with both majesty and restraint. Trumpets may sound at the queen's arrival. Officials may come out in state. The wealth brought home may be inventoried again. Tales of Solomon's brilliance may begin spreading through the court before the caravan is fully unloaded. Yet the deepest cargo of all is neither spice nor stone. It is the future person through whom Jerusalem will call again to the south. One day that son will ask about his father. One day his mother will answer. One day the ring will be placed in his hand like a key to a door that has been waiting since the night water was taken. And all the while, the hidden center of the story remains future-facing. The ark is not yet in motion. Jerusalem still keeps its holiest object. Yet the road toward Ethiopia is already being laid in flesh, kinship, and remembered favor. The old book is patient in this way. It lets ancestry become the first vehicle of transfer long before hands ever touch the sacred chest itself in Ethiopian memory. The Ethiopian story enjoys that kind of delayed unveiling. It understands that some things must move beneath the visible surface before they emerge as history, or at least as sacred royal memory. So do not rush the return journey. The Queen is traveling through more than geography. She is moving through the first quiet stage of fulfillment. Her body is now part of the story's secrecy. Her thoughts must have turned and returned to the same points in the heat of the day and the unsettled dark. What has changed? What will be born? What will be required of me when I reach home? How does one rule after standing in another king's wisdom and carrying his ring away beneath one's garments? Such questions would have no easy answer. Great legends often understand this much about human life. Destiny seldom feels grand while it is still hidden. It feels uncertain. It feels vulnerable. It feels like traveling with a truth that cannot yet be announced. There is also something deeply political happening beneath the personal layer. In the Kebra Nagast, the union between Solomon and Makeda is not only about private desire. It furnishes Ethiopia with dynastic nearness to Israel. It creates a future in which Ethiopian kingship may claim sacred ancestry, and that ancestry becomes one of the pillars supporting the later story of the Ark's presence in Ethiopia. Scholars, of course, treat the book as a medieval composition serving royal and religious legitimacy. That critical caution remains necessary. But once we step inside the narrative's own voice, the matter is told with solemn assurance. The Queen departs as the bearer of a future house, and the road keeps moving. Days lengthen. Encampments rise and fall. The same stars that looked down on Jerusalem now look down on the caravan moving back toward the south. Yet nothing is the same. One might say the Queen has become a vessel of two promises at once. One visible, the ring; one invisible, the child. Some versions of the larger tradition place the birth on the homeward journey. Others simply let the return end in the kingdom where the son will be raised. For voiceover purposes, it is enough to feel the expectancy. The road is now leading not only back to a throne, but toward a cradle. Before long, the child will be called Bina Lechem, and later Menyelek. Before long, a mother will place a ring into a young man's hand. Before long, Jerusalem will draw that son northward. Before long, the story's center of gravity will move from wisdom admired to inheritance claimed. But for now, stay with the Queen as she rides. The wind changes over the road. The animals breathe steadily. The treasure remains sealed. The attendants see only part of what they serve. And tucked inside the quiet dignity of her return is the seed of Ethiopia's boldest sacred memory. A king in Jerusalem has given a ring. A queen in the south carries it home. And somewhere ahead, still hidden beyond the next miles and the next months, waits the son through whom the path of the Ark will one day open. The road back to Ethiopia does not return Makeda to the life she had before. Outwardly, the kingdom receives its queen again, with the honors due to her. Courtiers come forward. Stewards open storage rooms. Servants unload the wealth that traveled north and south beneath dust and weather. News runs ahead of formal ceremony. The queen has seen Solomon. She has stood in Jerusalem. She has heard the famed wisdom with her own ears. No doubt the court wants every detail at once: the splendor of the city, the order of the palace, the force of the king's speech, the beauty of the offerings, the arrangement of his servants, the magnificence of his tables, the solemnity that surrounded the God of Israel. Yet there are truths a ruler cannot pour immediately into the hearing of a court. Some things must be carried inward for a season. So the Ethiopian story brings Makeda home, but it does not let her rest in mere recollection. What she has brought back from Jerusalem is living and hidden. The ring remains in her keeping. The memory of Solomon remains in her thoughts. And before long, the future begins to make itself known in her body. The old text marks the matter with the confidence of royal memory. It does not waver or wonder. It says that after the appointed months, on the homeward course, the queen gave birth to a son. The place is named in the tradition, Bala Zadisare, and the naming matters because sacred narratives often love to root themselves in remembered geography. The child is not born into abstraction. He enters the world on a road between kingdoms, under the sign of movement, inheritance, and return. His first breath belongs to a story already stretched between Jerusalem and Ethiopia. He is called Bena Lechem. The name is often rendered as son of the wise man, and that meaning is too beautiful for the old epic to resist. It is not merely a label. It is an interpretation. His very name becomes a sentence about origin. Before the child can speak, the tradition has already spoken over him. He comes from wisdom. He bears a bond the South cannot see yet in full, but the mother knows. Later generations know him more commonly as Menelik or Menelik, yet the first name has its own fragrance in the story. Bina Lechem sounds like a secret uttered softly in a royal chamber after the attendants have gone. It sounds like a mother holding the memory of a king far away while looking into the face of a son who carries that king's image into another land. A child born into such a legend can never be only private. Even if the court does not hear everything, the child's existence begins at once to alter the shape of expectation. He belongs to the queen, yes, but he also belongs to the future of a kingdom. Nurses lift him. Teachers will be assigned. Guards will stand nearer than common men stand. The household that surrounds him will learn quickly that silence is part of loyalty. Some children are cherished because they are royal. This child is also watched because he is mysterious. The Ethiopian imagination handles this period with a kind of patient grandeur. It does not rush to the ark. It does not hurry to the astonishing removal from Jerusalem that later comes. Instead, it lingers over the growing of the sun. That is wise storytelling. Great transfers rarely begin with the object that will later dominate memory. They begin with the making of the person through whom the transfer can occur. There is another quiet beauty in these years. He grows first as an Ethiopian son. The old story never treats him as incomplete until Jerusalem names him. He is trained where his mother reigns, shaped by southern discipline before northern recognition. That matters. It means the bond with Solomon will not erase Ethiopia, but deepen it. He travels later as one already formed, not as one begging for identity. And perhaps that is why his later refusal to remain in Jerusalem carries such weight. A man roots differently when a mother and a homeland have already taught him who he is. Recognition by a father can enlarge a life. It does not need to replace the ground on which that life was first made steady. That balance gives the story unusual dignity and inward strength already. So Bena Lechem grows. He grows beneath Ethiopian skies rather than Judean skies. He learns the habits of the southern court. He hears the voices of his mother's land before he ever hears the accents of Jerusalem. He is raised among attendants, soldiers, teachers, and all the ordered disciplines required for a royal heir. The old tradition says the queen delivered him over to instructors. That detail matters. Sacred royal stories often admire not only blood, but formation. A son may have magnificent ancestry, yet still need training, so tutors shape his mind. Men of war shape his posture. Courtly life shapes his bearing. He is taught how to stand before power without trembling and how to speak without wasting words. Knowledge of rank, discipline of body, practice in judgment, memory of law, control of appetite, fitness for leadership. Such things are not born complete. They are cultivated. One can imagine how the child must have looked as he began to pass from infancy into youth. At first, he would have been the queen's private tenderness. Then, he would have become the court's curiosity. Then, as years formed his face, he would have become the kingdom's quiet amazement. Because the tradition insists that he resembled Solomon. That is one of the loveliest and most unsettling details in the whole middle movement of the tale. The son grows, and with growth comes likeness. Features sharpen into inheritance. The line of the mouth, the cast of the eyes, the movement of the head, the carriage of the body. Again and again, the old story suggests that the father's image has crossed the distance and settled visibly upon the child. The queen does not need the ring every hour to remember Jerusalem. The boy's face begins to preach it. Now pause there for a moment, because it is one of the most human scenes in the whole legend. A mother carries memory. A son carries resemblance. A kingdom carries questions. How much did she tell him while he was small? Did she speak Solomon's name openly at first, or only when the room was guarded? Did she wait until he could bear the weight of the truth? Did she let the likeness speak before her own voice did? The Kebra Nagast does not answer every intimate question, and that silence is part of its power. It leaves room for the tenderness and unease that would naturally live in such a household. The queen has seen a man unlike any other ruler. She has returned, bearing his son. She rules a people who must one day understand why this child matters beyond ordinary succession. And all the while she must keep him from becoming vain because of what he is, or restless before his time. That last danger would not have been small. Children who sense destiny too early can become swollen with themselves. Children too carefully hidden can become hungry for what has been withheld. The queen must therefore hold a middle course. She cannot erase his origin. She also cannot allow his origin to devour his formation. So the years continue their measured labor. The child becomes a youth. The youth becomes a man. And the story, still moving with old-world dignity, allows his maturity to ripen under instruction before it permits him to ask the question that has been waiting in him since before he had words. Who is my father in full? Not in rumor, not in the indirect language of careful attendance, not in hints that pass between servants who stop speaking when he enters. In truth, when he reaches manhood, the desire clarifies. The old account says that at the age of 22, he asks leave to go and see the face of his father. The phrase is beautiful in its gravity. He does not ask merely to know about Solomon. He asks to behold him. In ancient worlds, to see the face of a king is not a casual expression. It means entrance into presence, recognition, relation, legitimacy, and judgment. He wants more than information. He wants encounter. That request must have landed on Makeda with both pride and ache. How could it not? Every mother knows that there are days when the child she carried begins to walk toward a knowledge that no maternal shelter can prevent. Yet this request is heavier than the ordinary sorrows of growth. If the young man goes to Jerusalem, the matter will become public. If he is recognized, the bond between Ethiopia and Solomon will cease to be only the queen's guarded memory. If he is not recognized, the wound will be immense. If he is kept home, he may never rest. That is why the scene deserves to be narrated without haste. A son stands before his mother. He is old enough now to travel as a prince. He is strong enough to endure the road. He is formed enough to bear royal conversation. He is restless enough that refusal would only deepen the fire within him. So she yields, but not thoughtlessly. She does what wise rulers and wise mothers both do. She prepares the truth for its hour. From among the things kept in memory and in concealment, she brings forth the sign Solomon gave her long ago, the ring. There is something deeply moving about that moment. For years, the ring has been more than ornament. It has been a witness resting in silence, a circle of gold carrying a history too charged for common handling. Now, it passes into another hand. The token once given on a night of thirst and strategy becomes the proof by which a son may stand before his father without being dismissed as an inventor of stories. The ring crosses generations like a bridge made small enough to fit in the palm, and with the ring comes the mother's instruction. One can imagine her voice lowering as she gives it. Guard this. Do not display it foolishly. Use it when the hour requires. Remember who you are. Remember whose son you are. Remember also whose people await your return. For that is the other crucial fact. The queen does not send him north in order to lose him. This is not a surrender of Ethiopia to Jerusalem. This is a mission of recognition that must end in return. The tension between attraction and return is one of the deep strengths of the narrative. Jerusalem shines in this legend. Solomon is made glorious. The God behind his wisdom is exalted. Yet the Ethiopian horizon is never abandoned. The sun goes north, but the story has already chosen the south as the place where his destiny will finally bear fruit. That choice matters, because it is part of how the Kebra Nagast makes Ethiopia not a footnote to Israel's story, but a place prepared to inherit sacred centrality. So travel is prepared again. The pattern returns, though under a different emotional light. Once it was the queen who left the south seeking wisdom. Now it is the son who leaves the south seeking recognition. Once the caravan carried gifts before a meeting. Now the prince carries a ring before a father's face. Once the road held the uncertainty of whether rumor was true. Now the road holds the uncertainty of whether lineage will be received. This is excellent storytelling because it creates both continuity and deepening without needing to say so aloud. The same lands lie between Ethiopia and Jerusalem, yet the journey is no longer the same journey. Roads change when the one walking them has changed. Before he departs, the queen's heart must have stretched in two directions at once. She wants him to know his father. She wants him back alive. She wants him affirmed. She fears he may be kept. She wants the bond honored. She fears the bond may swallow what she has protected. Such tensions make legends breathe. Without them, royal stories become carved stone. With them, they move like living memory. So let us picture the leaving clearly. The young man is no longer a child of whispered mystery. He is visibly princely. He stands with the strength of instruction behind him, and the secrecy of origin now turning toward disclosure. Servants make ready. Escorts are chosen. The queen speaks what she must. The ring is concealed, but not forgotten. The long route north gathers under his feet, and with that, the world of the tale narrows around one beautiful risk. Can a son whose face already echoes Solomon's truly stand in Jerusalem and be known? The answer is waiting in the city of his father. For now, Ethiopia watches him go, and the silence around the ring becomes the silence before recognition. When a man has spent years imagining the father he has never seen, The road toward that father gathers a strange double weight. Every mile brings him nearer to fulfillment and nearer to possible disappointment. Hope becomes sharper, not softer. The journey north for Benediction is therefore not only a royal errand, it is an inward trial. He carries the sign that can prove him, yet proof does not erase longing. The ring can open a door. It cannot tell him what waits on the other side. The old Ethiopian tradition gives the journey direction and firmness. It says he traveled by way of Gaza toward Jerusalem, not as a hidden wanderer, but as one moving under the seriousness of a claim that would soon test both courts. That detail of route helps the imagination. Roads are not magical in these stories. Even legends cross through named places. Sand still clings to sandals. Animals still tire. Men still sleep uneasily in border country. A prince on the way to the city of his father must still endure the old human facts of distance. Yet something unusual begins even before he reaches the palace. The resemblance arrives first. This is one of the most dramatic moments in the narrative. The son enters Jerusalem, and the people who look upon him are startled. They do not first say, "Here is a visitor from Ethiopia." They say, in effect, "The king has become young again." The face of Solomon seems to have returned in youth. The city is confronted by likeness before it is given explanation. That is marvelous storytelling, because it allows recognition to begin socially before it begins officially. The streets see what the throne will soon have to acknowledge. Imagine the effect. Servants turn twice to look. Old men narrow their eyes and murmur. Women at upper windows pause in their work. Officials at the gate speak more softly than before. Some feel delight. Some feel dread. Some feel the uncanny tremor that comes when inheritance walks into public view without introduction. Jerusalem has known Solomon's face for years. Now, it sees the same architecture of countenance carried by another body, younger and newly arrived from the south. A city can endure many wonders. It is not always prepared for the wonder of resemblance. That public astonishment matters because the Kebra Nagast is never content with private paternity. It wants the bond witnessed. It wants the claim to stand not as a hidden confidence between mother and child, nor even between child and father alone, but as something the world around them can feel almost against its will. The son's body speaks before the ring is shown. There is also a subtle mercy in the way the city recognizes him before the court does. Public astonishment in a scene like this softens the solitude of the son. He does not have to carry the whole burden of declaration by himself. Faces in the street prepare the air. Murmurs at the gate loosen the dread. By the time he stands before Solomon, he is not an implausible claimant forcing his way into royal attention. Jerusalem itself has begun the introduction. That would have steadied him. Even brave men feel the body protest when the moment of disclosure finally arrives. Hands grow warmer. Breath changes. The space between one heartbeat and the next can feel too large. Yet, every whisper that compared him to Solomon would have reminded him that he was not walking into fantasy. He was walking into likeness already recognized by others, and perhaps the father felt a related tremor from the other side. Kings command armies, judges, and servants, but they cannot command what a sudden resemblance will do to the heart. Before the ring was shown, before the formal words of acknowledgement were spoken, Solomon had already been confronted with a living return of a night he could never fully erase. That must have made the room feel both royal and painfully human. It also dignifies Makeda's long silence. She had not guarded a fantasy. She had guarded a truth strong enough to stand in daylight. Every face in Jerusalem that startled at the sight of the young man became, without intending it, a witness on her behalf. The mother far away was being vindicated by the city itself before any formal proclamation was made. Silence had lasted. Recognition now answered it in public. And then comes the court. One may picture halls already familiar to the listener from the Queen's earlier arrival cedar, order, servants trained to move without noise, judgment, and liturgy braided into the visible life of the kingdom. But what was once for Makeda a realm of testing, now becomes for her son a realm of exposure. She came to ask questions. He comes to answer one without speaking at first. Whose son are you? He enters the presence of Solomon. However, the scene is staged in one's imagination. It deserves a certain stillness. This is not a moment to rush with dramatic music. It is the stillness of a room in which two lives, long separated by geography and time, suddenly face one another beneath the weight of recognition. The father is no rumor now. The son is no longer only the mother's guarded secret. The living evidence of a night in Jerusalem stands before the king who arranged it. The tradition says Solomon tested him at first, hiding the matter as kings sometimes do when certainty is too charged to seize without form. That too feels true to royal narrative. A throne does not collapse into emotion immediately, not even before blood. A king may look, question, measure, restrain himself for a moment. Yet he cannot restrain the visible fact forever. The young man's likeness presses the truth forward. Then the ring confirms what the face already announced. There is something almost sacramental about the role of the ring here. It is small. It is material. It is silent. Yet, in the crucial hour, it mediates memory across years. Solomon sees it, and the past closes its distance. Whatever strategy, desire, tenderness, or calculation lived in that earlier night now stands embodied before him. The sign does what signs are meant to do. It joins word to reality. It turns claim into certainty. The king can say, not as speculation, but as acknowledgement, "Thou art my son, the issue of my body." At such a line, the story opens into emotion without dissolving into sentimentality, because there is joy here, unmistakably. But there is also consequence. A son found is not only a private delight for a monarch, it is a dynastic event. Recognition rearranges futures. Once Solomon receives him, the matter becomes larger than the two of them. Court, council, succession, policy, memory, and sacred history all begin to gather around the young man. The father has a son who bears his likeness and carries royal legitimacy through Makeda. The implications are immediate. No wonder Solomon wishes to keep him. In the Ethiopian story, this desire is entirely natural. Why would a king of such stature not want the son who mirrors him to remain near, perhaps even to stand in the line of succession? The narrative allows Solomon the grandeur of paternal delight and the instinct of dynastic preservation at the same time. He is not written as indifferent. He is drawn toward the son with force, but the young man does not come north in order to disappear into Jerusalem. That is the crucial resistance around which this part of the tale turns. He comes for recognition, blessing, and sight. He does not come to abandon his mother or the land that raised him. This refusal gives Benediction an honorable steadiness. He does not lose himself in the brilliance of the northern court. He is moved. Yes, he is surely thrilled, perhaps even shaken by having Solomon receive him. But he remains tethered to the south. That tether is not smallness, it is fidelity. Great sons in sacred stories are often those who can stand in a greater house without forgetting the obligation carried from home. So, imagine the conversations that must have followed. A father asking him to stay, a son speaking of his mother, a king pointing toward honor, position, magnificence, a prince insisting that his road bends back toward Ethiopia. Beneath the dialogue lies the deep structure of the whole book. Jerusalem gives legitimacy. Ethiopia receives future centrality. The son must touch the one in order to carry the other. There is also a subtler beauty here. Solomon does not reject the southern bond out of jealousy. The tradition allows him to adapt. If the son will not remain, then the father will send him back not as an isolated figure, but as the head of a company worthy of a new royal order. What cannot be preserved through proximity may yet be extended through sending. That principle matters, because it begins to transform the father's desire from possession into transmission. Transmission of status, transmission of blessing, transmission of institutional shape, transmission, eventually, of something much more dangerous. The old text says, Solomon commanded that the firstborn sons of the nobles and priests of Israel should depart with the young prince. Their presence is enormously significant. The boy who came seeking recognition will return surrounded by the firstborn of a kingdom. The symbolism is deliberate and powerful. He will not go back as a sentimental token of an old union. He will go back as the center of a structured migration of honor. Israel, in this narrative, begins to replicate some of itself in motion toward Ethiopia. Among those named in the tradition is Azarias, son of Zadok the priest. That name should not be rushed past. Priestly blood is entering the movement. This is no mere escort of warriors and servants. The company that gathers around the young prince carries social, political, and sacred significance. Nobility and priesthood are both represented. The future Ethiopian order, as imagined by the Kebra Nagast, is not to be a distant colonial echo of Jerusalem, but a true inheriting realm in which royal legitimacy and sacred relation travel together. One can imagine how the command fell upon the households of Jerusalem. Fathers hearing that, firstborn sons must go. Mothers trying to remain composed while inwardly breaking. Young nobles astonished that their futures have suddenly been rerouted southward. Priestly households weighing obedience against grief. Whenever history, or legend that presents itself as history, changes direction, someone must leave a beloved world behind. Magnificent claims are often built upon private sorrows. That sorrow is essential to the next movement. If the sons were sent away gladly, the later secret around Dion would lose much of its emotional logic. But if they grieve, if they feel the pain of leaving Jerusalem, if they cannot bear the idea of going south stripped of the holiest nearness they have known, then the story has prepared the conditions in which desperate sacred theft can seem to those performing it, less like robbery and more like unwilling obedience to a providence they barely understand. Still, that darker development has not yet fully stepped forward. For now, we remain in the brightness of recognition and commissioning. The Father sees the Son. The Son is blessed. The city is astonished. The company is formed, and within all of it, another detail glimmers with exquisite subtlety. In some retellings of the larger tradition, the prince asks not for the ark itself, nor even imagines possessing it, but for some small contact with what covers it, a fringe, a tassel, some trace that might honor the sacred place from which his father's realm receives its deepest weight. That desire is revealing. It portrays him not as a crude plunderer, but as one who reveres what Jerusalem holds. He does not stride into the temple imagining that holiness can be requisitioned like tribute. He asks little. The story will soon give vastly more, and that is often how great legends work. Someone asks for a token, providence, or the terrible machinery of destiny, gives an ark. Before that terrible turn arrives, there is space for one more human image. Imagine Solomon looking at the son who resembles him. Imagine the ache within such joy, for even in recognition there is loss. A found son is also a son who means future separation when his allegiance bends homeward. Perhaps that is why the father's generosity becomes so large. He cannot keep the young man beside him. So he loads honor upon him. He surrounds him with firstborn companions. He sends him away not as an uncertainty, but as a figure publicly acknowledged, royally weighted, and inseparable from his own memory. That is how the face that returned young begins to leave again. Jerusalem has seen Solomon in another body. Solomon has seen his own blood in another generation. The court has accepted what the streets first suspected, and somewhere beyond the visible conversations of farewell, Azarias and the other firstborn sons are beginning to feel a grief fierce enough to tempt the holiest boundary in the kingdom. Farewells in royal cities are never made of one emotion alone. There is ceremony on the surface. There is grief underneath. There is obedience spoken aloud. There is resistance muttering in the private chambers of the heart. The company gathered around Benediction now stands within all four conditions at once. They have been commanded to accompany the acknowledged son of Solomon back toward Ethiopia. They are firstborn sons of nobles and priests, not minor figures whose absence can be overlooked. Jerusalem is not sending loose attendants on a diplomatic errand. It is releasing representative life, concentrated honor, treasured future. In the old Ethiopian imagination, the southward movement must look worthy of the kingdom that sends it. So the company is rich in significance. Yet what the narrative also insists upon is their sorrow. They do not rejoice to leave the city of David's son. Their obedience is real, but so is their pain. That pain is the dark well from which the next act rises. Among them stands Azarias, son of Zadok, the priest. Priestly nearness matters here. The closer a man stands to holy things, the more unbearable distance from holy things may become. Jerusalem for such a man is not only home, it is the place where liturgy has shape, where sacrifice has pattern, where the sanctuary gives orientation to the whole land. To be sent away from the city is already grief. To be sent away from the presence signified by Yeyon is another level of severance altogether. Now we should speak carefully, because this part of the story is one of the most audacious in all the Kebra Nagast. The book does not merely say that Ethiopia received a pious memory of Israel. It says the living sign of divine presence left Jerusalem. That is an astonishing claim. In Budge's title framing, the work announces itself as the history of the departure of God and his Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. The boldness of that line cannot be overstated. It is not only an antiquarian tale about ancient kings. It is a transfer narrative of sacred center. The old Ethiopian tradition is not asking for symbolic kinship alone. It is asserting relocation. Such a claim requires more than a tidy departure scene. It requires a crisis. It requires men desperate enough to act. It requires, above all, a way of imagining the act not as simple sacrilege, but as something heaven itself has strangely allowed. That is where the grief of the firstborn sons becomes spiritually combustible. They will not leave empty. Not empty of memory only. Not empty of status only. Empty of teon. The sacred name here is crucial. In the world of the text, teon is not a decorative synonym dropped into the story for poetic effect. It carries presence, weight, divine nearness. The dwelling sign by which God's favor and kingship are understood in relation to Israel. To leave Jerusalem without, Vion feels to these men like leaving the sun behind and pretending a lamp is enough. So the plot begins to gather in shadow. Ancient stories often narrow at the holiest point, voices lower, plans become secretive, conscience and desire begin to mingle in dangerous ways. What would be sheer theft in one register starts to dress itself as providence in another. That does not remove the shock of the deed. It deepens it. The narrative makes Azarias central to the movement. He and the grieving companions determined to take the tabernacle of the law of God, Kion, with them. A wooden substitute is prepared. The holy object is secretly removed. The copy is set in place. One can feel the nerve required for such an act, even inside legend. Sacred boundaries are not casually crossed. Even to narrate their crossing is to invoke dread. A scene like that invites the imagination to slow down around the substitute itself. Somewhere in the dark, a crafted likeness waits where the true holy object had stood. Wood imitates what it cannot contain. Shape pretends to equal presence. For a few stolen hours, appearance covers absence. The image is powerful because it says something almost universal about human religion and political life. How often men cling to the outline of holiness after holiness has already gone. One can also feel the theological daring of the replacement. If the copy remains for a time while the reality is gone, then the story is saying that sacred legitimacy cannot be preserved by architecture alone. A sanctuary may still stand, ritual may still continue, priests may still move through familiar motions. Yet if Joan has departed, the center has departed with her. That is the kind of claim only a civilization-sized legend would dare to make. That is why the southward caravan feels lit from within. It is not merely transporting a relic. It is carrying a verdict about where divine favor will now be remembered. The young men may not yet possess language for the full magnitude of it, but the journey itself is already teaching them. Some departures do not leave holiness behind. They take holiness onward. There is another reason this part of the legend stays powerful. It forces a painful question into view. Can the center of a people's worship truly move away from the city that first received it? The answer of the Kebra Nagast is not argued like a treatise. It is narrated through movement. The company keeps advancing. The burden remains with them. The miracle does not fail. Step by step, mile by mile, the story makes distance itself into testimony. That narrative method is brilliant. Instead of stopping to defend the claim, the book lets the journey defend it. If Vion were unwilling, the road would become judgment. If heaven opposed the act, the travelers would collapse into capture. But the opposite happens. Forward motion continues, and with every continuing mile, the old Ethiopian confidence grows stronger. What Jerusalem guarded for a season, Ethiopia will guard hereafter, and the sorrow of the firstborn sons deepens that claim. They are not running from Jerusalem because it means nothing. They are carrying Pion because Jerusalem means too much to leave behind in fragments. Loss itself becomes the furnace in which transfer is imagined as necessary, fearful, and strangely faithful. And the miles keep saying the same. Imagine the night of it. Jerusalem sleeps in layers. Some servants rest. Some guards pace slowly. Some priests perhaps keep their regular attentions without suspecting that the center itself is about to move. The city that has held the ark does not yet know it is on the edge of deprivation. In secret, hands accustomed to reverence commit the unthinkable. That paradox is one of the reasons the story endures. The deed is not done by pagans mocking Israel's God. It is done by men who fear holiness enough to know its worth and ache over leaving it behind. Their reverence does not prevent the act. It becomes, in the internal logic of the legend, part of what drives it. And where is Bena Lechem while this unfolds? The Ethiopian tradition often preserves his ignorance at this stage. That detail matters immensely. It protects his character from being flattened into calculated thief. He stands as the destined bearer, not necessarily the architect of the removal. He asked, according to one strand of the tradition, only for a small sign connected to the ark's covering. What travels with him will be more than he requested, more than he imagined. perhaps even more than he can fully understand, until the journey itself reveals the truth. That distinction is narratively elegant. The son remains honorable. The priestly companions become agents of the terrifying transfer. Providence, if one speaks from inside the book's own worldview, seems to move through the sorrow of men rather than through an official royal decree. Once the removal is accomplished, departure is no longer simple travel. It becomes flight wrapped in ceremony. The company goes out under the appearance of lawful sending, but within the company is the most dangerous and precious burden imaginable. The holy center has shifted, or at least the text speaks as if it has. From this point onward, Ethiopia is not merely receiving a prince with distinguished companions. It is receiving Tion herself, and then the legend intensifies. It does not leave the caravan to trudge at ordinary pace, beneath unbearable sacred risk. It gives the Ark power. The journey south becomes miraculously accelerated. The text speaks of movement above the ground, like a wagon borne swiftly, as though the earth itself can scarcely hinder the passage once Peon has chosen or consented or been compelled by Providence to travel with the company. This is important because miracle in such narratives is not ornament. It is validation. The unnatural speed signifies divine sanction where human readers might otherwise see only profanation. Not with shouting, not with spectacle for its own sake, with wonder edged by fear. Picture the company setting out. Animals should tire, yet the pace does not falter. Road should resist, yet the way seems strangely yielded. Men who expected dust and delay begin to feel that they are being carried through more than ordinary terrain. Some may scarcely dare to speak. Some may feel elation, rising with terror. Some may begin to understand that they are not simply fugitives from Solomon's city. They are participants in a relocation so vast, it will someday define kingdoms. And still, beneath the miracle, there is human feeling. The firstborn sons have not ceased to be sons. They are leaving fathers behind. They are leaving mothers behind. They are leaving courtyards, prayers, familiar stones, remembered mornings, and all the patterns by which one knows a city is home. Even if they believe heaven has favored the transfer, grief does not disappear. Sacred destiny rarely removes homesickness. Often it sharpens it. That gives the whole movement a painful beauty. A band of young men, crowned with obedience and burdened by loss, goes south carrying the sign that once made Jerusalem central. Their tears and their triumph mingle. That mixture feels ancient and true. At some point, of course, absence will be noticed. A wooden substitute cannot forever satisfy the eyes that know what stood before them. Silence cannot indefinitely cover removal. The old story knows this, and so it stretches tension like a cord. Southward motion continues while the possibility of discovery hangs behind it. Will Solomon pursue? Will Jerusalem cry out? Will heaven expose the deed or confirm it? Such questions give the road its pulse. The broader legend says Solomon eventually learns the truth and is stricken, yet the miraculous movement of the company outpaces pursuit. By the time the matter is grasped in full, the decisive crossing has been made. The ark has gone where the story intends it to go. That is why this moment is so central to Ethiopian sacred memory. It is not merely about possession. It is about chosen transfer, guarded by speed beyond ordinary speed, enclosed within a narrative where divine favor no longer appears fixed to one geography. Once the company bears Tion toward Ethiopia, the whole map of holiness is being redrawn within the imagination of the text. There is a larger historical note that belongs quietly in the background. Modern scholarship sees the Kebra Nagast as a medieval Ethiopian epic written in Ge'ez in its surviving form and shaped to support Solomonic royal ideology. That caution should remain with any careful reader. Yet inside the narrative's own world, the claim is voiced with complete solemnity. Ethiopia is not pretending to greatness. It is inheriting greatness through a transfer heaven has allowed. And perhaps this is why the story never lost its force in Ethiopian Christian imagination. Britannica notes how deeply the Ark remains woven into Ethiopian church life, where every church possesses an Ark-related sacred item, and where Gejez scripture, liturgy, and wide canonical memory help preserve such traditions across centuries. The Kebra Nagast did not survive as an idle curiosity. It lived because it spoke into a religious world, ready to hear Ethiopia as a land marked by covenantal nearness. Now bring the camera of the mind back down to the road. A prince travels. Firstborn sons travel. Priestly sorrow travels. And hidden among them travels Zion. Jerusalem recedes behind them, though her wound is not yet fully cried aloud. The south draws nearer, though it does not yet know what is coming to it. In the hush of that impossible movement, one truth has already hardened inside the legend. Ethiopia will not receive only a lineage from Solomon. It will receive the sign by which lineage becomes sacred kingdom. So, the company does not go empty. It goes weighted with glory, danger, grief, and a presence no ordinary escort would dare to name too loudly. And as the miles fall away beneath miracle, the story approaches the hour when the South will behold not only Solomon's son, but the terrible gift that changed the world of the Kebra Nagast forever. At first, the company rides as men ride after any dangerous deed, outwardly composed, inwardly listening. Nothing yet in the visible arrangement of the caravan declares the full magnitude of what has happened. Baggage is piled, wagons creak, animals are guided forward, men speak in practical tones, dust rises. The ordinary surfaces of departure remain intact, and that is fitting, because the most consequential acts in old sacred epics often begin concealed beneath the look of common travel. A kingdom can lose its center while still appearing, for a few hours, unchanged, yet concealment has limits. What has been taken from Jerusalem is not the sort of burden that can remain spiritually mute for long. The Kebra Nagast loves that tension. It allows Azariah's and the firstborn sons to move out beneath secrecy, but only for a brief span. The true drama is not merely that they have stolen Tion. It is that once Tion begins to move, the world itself starts to behave as if it knows. The old Sumerian budge lingers over the departure, with almost theatrical sound. There are cries of men, wailings of women, howlings of dogs, screams of asses. Whether one hears those details as literal tumult, epic heightening, or both, the effect is unforgettable. Jerusalem does not lose the Ark in serene silence. The city seems to groan around the removal, as if creatures lower than kings have perceived the disturbance before the palace fully understands it. Then, the miracle begins. Not later, not after many weary stages. At once. The text does not present the road south as a merely successful escape. It presents it as an altered mode of travel, a journey transformed by sacred presence. The company, the animals, even the wagons, are said to move above the ground, not high like clouds, but high enough to defeat ordinary resistance, high enough to make the earth itself seem unable to bind what now leaves Jerusalem. They go with the speed of the bat and the eagle. Distances collapse beneath them. Heat is checked. The Archangel Michael goes ahead, cutting a path and sheltering them. That image deserves to be held in the imagination. Young men who expected strain feel lightness under their feet. Drivers who know the stubbornness of wheels feel wagons move without the full drag of earth. Animals that should labor seem carried. The whole company, still wrapped in danger, enters a kind of terrible ease. When miracle appears in ancient narrative at just such a moment, It is doing more than exciting the listener. It is rendering judgment. If the removal of Veon were only crime, one would expect hindrance, pursuit, exposure, breakdown. Instead, the journey itself becomes a declaration. The road does not condemn the company. It yields them passage. That is why this stretch of the Kebra Nagast is so important. The miracle is the argument. And yet the emotional heart of the scene does not lie only in supernatural speed. It lies in delayed knowledge. Because Benediction, the sun at the center of the whole national destiny, is still moving within partial understanding. He knows he has been recognized by Solomon. He knows he has been honored and sent out with the firstborn sons of Israel. He knows the journey has become wondrous beyond expectation. But he does not yet know the full reason. That delay is narratively elegant. It preserves a distinction between chosen bearer and conscious conspirator. It lets the sacred burden draw near to him before the truth is spoken. He is not written as a cunning architect of theft. He is the royal center around whom providence is gathering facts faster than he can comprehend them. One can imagine his sensations during those first stages of flight. He must know something is wrong with ordinary categories. This is not simply favorable weather. This is not merely a well-ordered caravan. Something greater than planning has entered the movement. The men around him may be carrying joy too intense to hide. Their eyes may meet too knowingly. Their reverence may deepen at certain moments. They may glance toward the concealed burden with an emotion impossible to mistake, though not yet easy to interpret. Silence itself begins to thicken. Every great secret eventually changes the air in which men breathe. The company reaches the frontier waters with impossible swiftness. Budge's summary says the Nile at the boundary of Egypt is reached in a time no ordinary caravan could have matched. What should have taken many days is consumed in one. Such compression of distance matters in legends of transfer. Time itself appears to cooperate with relocation. The farther the company advances without obstruction, the stronger becomes the sense that Ethiopia is not stealing glory by human daring alone. Glory is traveling because it has been permitted to travel. It is there, near the waters, that the concealed heart of the journey is unveiled. The companions choose their hour carefully. Now there is enough distance from Jerusalem that revelation can occur without immediate collapse. Now there is enough wonder already in the journey that the truth will not sound impossible. Now the prince who left as acknowledged son can be shown what else has been laid upon him. Azarias speaks. The moment is one of the great reveals in the whole epic. He tells Benediction that the tabernacle Zion is with them. He is told not simply that some relic has been taken, nor that a symbolic treasure has been hidden among the baggage, but that the very object through which Jerusalem knew divine nearness now accompanies his southward road. In some tellings, the phrase comes with maternal tenderness as much as reverence. This is thy mother, the Lady of Zion. That expression is astonishing. The sacred object is not introduced as cold loot. It is introduced as a living lady, a motherly presence, a queenly bearer of divine favor. How would a man receive such a revelation? With fear first, perhaps, then disbelief, then a rush of joy too strong for stillness. The old story chooses joy. When Benediction, who has also borne the royal name David, beholds Zion, he does not stand with cautious diplomacy. He leaps. He dances. Budge's summary says he skipped like a young sheep before the tabernacle. The phrasing is wonderfully vivid. All princely restraint breaks into exaltation. He becomes, in that instant, not only Solomon's son, but David's descendant in liturgical movement. The comparison is deliberate and powerful. As David danced before the ark, so now the Ethiopian heir dances before it. Lineage is confirmed not only by blood and coronation, but by bodily worship. That dance is one of the hidden hinges of the whole book. There is another subtle strength in the way the story arranges this revelation. If Bena Lechem had known everything from the moment of departure, the miracle might feel like the reward of a plotted scheme. But because he learns only after the journey is already impossibly unfolding, the wonder overtakes him rather than serving him. He must respond as any listener would respond, with amazement that outruns planning. And that makes his joy feel cleaner, more childlike, and more liturgical. It also means the arc chooses the emotional timing of the scene. First, the company is carried. Then, the prince is told. Then, he dances. First, movement. Then, knowledge. Then, worship. The order is beautiful. The body feels the miracle before the mind can name it. The road prepares the revelation, and the revelation breaks into praise. That sequence gives the whole episode the shape of a rite, almost as if Ethiopia must be initiated into receiving Kion through awe before it is allowed to understand her fully. It also helps explain why later Ethiopian memory could speak of the journey with such confidence. The company was not imagined as dragging holiness unwillingly through dust. They were imagined as being born by holiness. Once that distinction is made, the entire episode changes color. Fear remains, but fear is wrapped in chosenness, and the southward road becomes less an escape route than a consecrated passage. Even the secrecy gains meaning now. What began as concealment for safety becomes concealment before epiphany. The holy thing is hidden only until the right heart is ready to rejoice. Then the secret opens, and the journey becomes praise instead of escape. For a moment, politics drops away. Dynasty drops away. Even the danger of pursuit drops away. What remains is joy in presence. The southward transfer is authenticated by delight. The sun's response is not greedy triumph, but ecstatic reverence. This matters immensely for the moral imagination of the epic. Had he greeted the ark as plunder, the whole scene would darken irreparably. But he greets it as gift, as wonder, as holy nearness beyond deserving. That reaction allows the tradition to frame Ethiopia's inheritance not as sacrilegious opportunism, but as receiving what God has somehow permitted to depart from Jerusalem. And then comes the communal response. Once the truth is out, the company is no longer merely an escort protecting a royal traveler. It becomes a liturgical procession, in exile from one center and in movement toward another. The ark is dressed. Gifts are spread before it. Draperies of purple appear. Reverence becomes visible. The journey south is no longer just movement through space. It is ceremony in motion. Imagine the contrast. A few days earlier, these young men were sons of Israel, grieving that they must leave Jerusalem. Now they are guardians of Kion on the open road. Grief has not vanished, but grief has been transfigured. They are still leaving home, yet they are not leaving empty. That transformation is central to the genius of this section. The pain of departure becomes the very condition through which a new sacred geography is born. The firstborn sons could not bear separation from the holy center. Therefore, in the story's own terrifying logic, the holy center traveled with them. Loss and gift become entangled so tightly that one cannot tell where sorrow ended and providence began. The journey continues under that changed knowledge. Now every mile has double meaning. It is 1 mile farther from Solomon's temple. It is 1 mile nearer to Ethiopia's destiny. It is 1 mile of increasing danger should pursuit succeed. It is 1 mile of increasing confidence because the miracle has not ceased. The air over the company must have felt charged with something close to liturgical fear. Men would speak, but softly. They would act, but carefully. There is a difference between escorting treasure and escorting presence. The first demands vigilance. The second demands reverence and vigilance braided together. One can also imagine the inner turn in Baina Lekem himself. Before, he was returning as a recognized son. Now, he returns as bearer of a mystery large enough to define a civilization. Before, the road home promised honor. Now, it promises a transformed homeland. No wonder his joy is so violent and so tender. A man may endure the burden of being heir. To discover that heaven's sign has attached itself to that heirship is another matter entirely. Such a revelation would humble and exalt at once. And what of Azarias? He emerges here as one of the most dangerous and fascinating figures in the epic. He is priestly, grieving, bold enough to violate the inviolable, and reverent enough to make that violation seem in his own conscience an act of fidelity. Characters like that are never small. They carry both sanctity and risk. He is not a neat villain because the book refuses to condemn him. He is not a neat saint because what he has done remains terrifying. He stands in that old and troubling place where sacred history often locates its agents, doing what should not be done, yet doing it inside a narrative that insists heaven has ratified the deed. The road south, therefore, becomes a long unveiling, not only of the Ark, of Ethiopia, of the prince, of the companions, of what Jerusalem has actually lost. By the time the company moves on from the waters, the truth has changed everyone within it. Nothing is merely diplomatic now. Every halt, every camp, every dawn belongs to the history of transference. And still the miracle keeps testifying. The archangel leads. The sun cannot fully oppress them. The earth cannot fully hinder them. The interval between places contracts. A caravan has become something more like a sacred arrow already released from the bow. That is why this section of the story must be told with awe rather than haste. It is the hinge between concealment and proclamation. Before the revelation, the company escapes with a secret. After the revelation, it travels with a destiny. Soon enough, Jerusalem will understand what has happened. Soon enough, Solomon will hear that the glory has gone. Soon enough, lament, pursuit, and collapse will rise behind the fleeing company like a storm. But for this moment, on the road made light beneath Yeon, the old Ethiopian imagination dares to say something immense. The lady who once rested in the Holy of Holies has already begun to choose the south. No loss is fully real in a royal city until it has been named within the center of power. Jerusalem may have shuddered already. The night may have carried its own disquiet. The movement of the caravan may already be too swift for human pursuit. Yet the catastrophe must still pass through discovery. Some priest must look and fail to see what should be there. Some servant must sense that substitution has mocked familiarity. Some cry must rise from the sanctuary outward until the palace can no longer speak in ordinary tones. The Kebra Nagast understands the force of that moment. It does not let the removal of Yeon remain merely a southern triumph. It insists that Jerusalem feel the emptiness. Budge's summary preserves one unforgettable detail. Zadok the priest, learning what has happened, faints in shock. That is exactly the right image. A holy center has been hollowed out. The body of the priest responds before administrative order can. One should linger over that fainting. It tells us something important. The loss of the Ark in this story is not treated as the disappearance of a symbolic relic among other sacred objects. It is treated as the collapse of orientation. When the thing at the center is gone, men nearest to it cannot remain physically composed. Such details are why the tale continues to grip listeners across centuries. It imagines spiritual loss as bodily event. Soon the news reaches Solomon, and no, The narrative shifts from miraculous procession to royal wound. The father who had just found a son learns that the son's departure has carried away not only paternal longing, but the chief sign of divine nearness in Jerusalem. This double loss is part of what gives Solomon's grief its bitterness. He does not simply miss Benediction, he loses Chen with him. Blood has gone south. Glory has gone south. The city remains, but its center has moved. The king acts as kings act. When outrage and terror strike together, he commands pursuit. Not mild retrieval, not diplomatic inquiry. Pursuit with lethal intent. Budge's summary says he ordered men to overtake those who had stolen Zion and slay them when they were found. That is a hard line, and it should remain hard in the telling. For all the later beauty of Ethiopian inheritance, the loss from Jerusalem's side is violent, scandalous, unbearable. Solomon does not first respond as a theologian admiring providence. He responds as a king stripped in his own house. Imagine the sudden activity. Stables burst into use. Messengers run. Weapons are made ready. Road reports are demanded. Dust rises from horses sent after a caravan already beyond ordinary reach. The city that had dazzled Makeda and then received Benediction in astonishment now finds itself reduced to reactive motion. There is something humiliating in that transformation. The center of worldly magnificence is forced into pursuit of what has already escaped under the sanction of miracle. The irony is severe. Solomon, whose wisdom once ordered all things, now chases after what wisdom cannot retrieve. For the road has changed sides. When Makeda first journeyed north, Jerusalem stood as destination, source, answer. Now, Jerusalem becomes the place left behind, the city straining after its own departing heart. That reversal is one of the governing pleasures of the epic, and the pursuit fails. Of course it fails. The narrative has already made failure inevitable by the nature of the miracle. Men and animals born above the ground, the archangel clearing the way, distances consumed at impossible speed. What human cavalry can answer that? The power of the pursuit lies not in its success, but in the fact that it dramatizes Solomon's helplessness. He may command, but command cannot reverse transfer when transfer has become sacred destiny. Some versions of the summary intensify the scene further by reporting what Solomon learns along the route. In Egypt, idols and statues are said to fall and break because Tion has passed through. This detail expands the meaning of the ark's movement. The journey south is not only escape from Israelite pursuit, it is also a victorious crossing through lands of false gods. Presence does not travel neutrally. It judges as it goes. That image is potent. The ark moves. Idols topple. Kings hear rumors too late. By the time Solomon reaches the relevant places, the world has already begun adjusting to absence in Jerusalem and holy motion elsewhere. One can picture the king receiving these reports with a face altered beyond ordinary grief. He had wanted his son near. He had sent him away with honor. Now honor has become deprivation. The son is beyond him. The ark is beyond him. Even the nations along the route seem to have felt the passage more decisively than he can effect it. So he laments. The exact words vary across retellings, but the mood is unmistakable. Woe, astonishment, bereavement, recognition that the glory of Israel has gone to the south. And that phrase, gone to the south, is one of the deepest pulses in the whole legend. Geography becomes theology. Direction becomes destiny. South is no longer merely down the map from Jerusalem. South is where favor now travels. The Kebra Nagast could have stopped there and still possessed a grand transfer legend. But it does something darker and more psychologically interesting. It binds the loss of Tion to the withering of Solomon's own spiritual life. That is a crucial move. The epic does not treat the king as unchanged after the departure. It says the loss had a sad effect upon him. His love for God waned. His wisdom forsook him. He gave himself increasingly to women during the last years of his life. Then comes the Egyptian princess, Mafshura, daughter of Pharaoh, who draws him toward the worship of idols. This is not accidental moral decline inserted merely to echo the biblical account of Solomon's fall. In the Ethiopian story, it serves a structural purpose. Jerusalem does not simply lose the ark externally. It begins to lose fidelity internally. Once Tion has departed, Solomon's house becomes vulnerable to substitution in the soul, just as the sanctuary had been left with substitution in wood. That parallel is brilliant. A copy remains where reality once stood. Then false worship rises where true devotion had once ruled. Outer absence and inner compromise mirror one another. The daughter of Pharaoh enters the tale, therefore, as more than seductive figure. She is the embodiment of what happens when wisdom no longer stands under the same protection. She flatters, persuades, and gently reorders the atmosphere of the palace. Household religion shifts. Toleration becomes participation. Royal dignity bends into compromise. It is a devastating descent precisely because it is not narrated first as open rebellion. It comes by consolation, by weakness, by weary surrender after grief. There is, too, a cruel theological intelligence in the way the story stages Solomon's helplessness. He is not ignorant of what the ark means. He is not some shallow monarch who valued it as mere prestige. He understands, perhaps better than anyone, that the sanctuary is the meeting point of kingship, covenant, memory, and judgment. That is exactly why his grief matters so much. Lesser men can be angry when treasure is taken. Solomon is shattered because what has been taken is inseparable from the order of the world as he knew it. And notice how the narrative lets him discover the loss only after he has chosen generosity toward his son. That ordering sharpens the wound. He had opened his hand. He had accepted separation. He had sent the prince away with honor. Then comes the realization that the farewell carried a second meaning he never intended. Such sequencing prevents his sorrow from feeling merely possessive. He is not only a king outraged by theft, he is a father and ruler whose act of noble sending has been turned by hidden action and providential reversal into the very channel of deprivation. The pursuit, therefore, becomes tragic before it becomes futile. Solomon is chasing more than fugitives. He is chasing the moment before knowledge, the last instant in which Jerusalem was still what it had been. Every hoofbeat after the caravan is also a desire to undo revelation itself. Yet the story grants him no such mercy. The farther he rides, the clearer the finality becomes. One might even say that Solomon becomes the negative proof of Ethiopia's election. His diminishing wisdom, his inability to recover Vaon, and his yielding to alien worship all testify, within the logic of the text, that the old center has truly been judged. The king remains splendid, but splendor without presence can only decay into memory. That is why the failed pursuit must be imagined almost musically. Hooves strike, orders fly, dust lifts, scouts return, and all the noise of recovery only underlines absence. Jerusalem can still produce motion, but it cannot produce return. Authority remains noisy after holiness has gone quiet. The king can command a chase. He cannot command the world to become what it was that morning. And perhaps that is the saddest irony of all. The man once famed for discerning truth must now learn truth from loss. Wisdom remains in memory around him, but it no longer rules events. The South has become the place where living certainty travels faster than royal understanding. This is why his later corruption through the daughter of Pharaoh should not be narrated as a cartoon of lust. It is decay after desecration, or what feels to him like desecration. The palace becomes vulnerable, where the sanctuary has become empty. He takes comfort, where he should have taken warning. He allows softness, where he once embodied judgment. In that sense, the idolatry is not a disconnected sequel. It is the inward echo of outward loss. And still, the story grants him one dignity that matters greatly. He recognizes fully the scale of what has happened. He does not shrug. He does not relativize. He mourns as a king who knows that a civilization can survive the loss of wealth more easily than the loss of holy presence. That grief gives him tragic stature to the end, and that, too, feels human. Great men often do not fall at the hour of triumph. They fall after loss. They fall when absence hollows them. They fall when old certainties have gone and comfort appears wearing the face of tenderness. So the Egyptian wife does not merely tempt Solomon. She finds him wounded. From the Ethiopian perspective, this deepens the claim that divine favor has truly shifted. A city no longer guarded by Tion becomes susceptible to the very idolatries that the ark's presence had judged along the road. What happened externally in Egypt, images falling before the ark, now happens inversely in Jerusalem, where living devotion falls before images. If one listens closely, the irony is almost unbearable. The ark passes through lands of idols and breaks them. Then the king left behind at Jerusalem allows idols into his own world. The contrast could scarcely be sharper. Meanwhile, Benediction and the company continue southward under a different atmosphere altogether. The father sinks as the sun rises. The old capital mourns while the future capital prepares to receive. The king of wisdom becomes a figure of lament and compromise, while the young bearer of Vion becomes a figure of expectation, lit by miracle. This is how the Kebra Nagast writes Translatio Imperii and Translatio Sanctitatis not as abstract doctrine, but as emotional reversal. One house dims, another brightens, yet even here, a wise telling should preserve some tenderness towards Solomon. He is not rendered in the epic as a trivial fool. His grief has grandeur. He knows what has been lost. He feels the wound in a measure proportionate to the glory once given him. That is why his lament matters. If he were small, Ethiopia's inheritance would not appear as magnificent. It is because Solomon is still immense that the departure of Vion from him carries such world-shaping force. Think of him at last returning to Jerusalem, the pursuit exhausted, reports gathered, the irreversible now undeniable, the city before him still standing, the sanctuary still present, yet everything altered. There may be no more painful royal image in this part of the story than that. A king returning to the place that is still his, yet no longer entirely what it was. The architecture remains, the prestige remains, the memory remains, but the glory has gone. And once a man becomes convinced that glory has gone, he can begin to live as one living after sunset. That is the shadow into which Solomon passes. The south has the ark. The south has the sun. The south has the future. Jerusalem has memory, magnificence, and a king whose wisdom begins to fray around the edges of bereavement. The stage is now fully set for the reception in Ethiopia. For while lament spreads in the north, another kind of music is gathering in the south. Music for return, for abdication, for enthronement, and for the moment when Makeda will behold not only her son, but the glory that came home with him. Before the caravan appears on the horizon of Ethiopia, expectation itself has already begun riding ahead of it. News always outruns procession. Some messenger sees dust where there should be none. Some scout hears impossible reports of speed. Some servant reaches court with a breathless half-account that sounds too magnificent to doubt and too magnificent to understand. The Son has returned. The company from Jerusalem is with him. And more than that, something holy beyond ordinary embassy approaches with them. For Makeda, this must have been the hour when memory, fear, promise, and fulfillment all collided. She had once journeyed north, seeking wisdom. She had returned carrying hidden future in her body. She had raised that future in secrecy, discipline, and royal patience. She had sent him forth with the ring. Now, he comes back, not only recognized, not only honored, but carrying the very mystery toward which the whole book has been leaning. One should pause and honor the magnitude of her role here. Too often in quick retellings, she is remembered only for visiting Solomon and bearing his son. But the Ethiopian tradition gives her more than romantic consequence. She is the ruler who preserves continuity long enough for fulfillment to arrive. She is the mother who knows how to let destiny leave and return. She is the queen who does not cling to power when the appointed heir stands before her. That last element is crucial. The arrival scene is not merely maternal reunion. It is political transfer. It is dynastic fulfillment. It is the remaking of Ethiopian kingship under the sign of Solomon and Dion. The people go out to meet the returning company. Budge's summary evokes drums, pipes, flutes, loud rejoicing, public astonishment that the tabernacle of the law of God is now in their midst. This is one of the most exultant tonal shifts in the whole epic. Jerusalem's discovery was shock and collapse. Ethiopia's discovery is festival and wonder. The same event that hollowed one kingdom crowns another with meaning. Imagine the first sight. Purple draperies around Theon. The companions from Israel marked by the gravity of what they have carried. The prince now radiant, not only with lineage, but with impossible success. The queen advancing to meet him, bearing all the poise of one who understands that private joy must now become public order. How does a people greet the arrival of something they believe to be the Ark of the Covenant itself? Not as spectators, as participants in sacred upheaval. Their shouting, music, and movement are not decoration around history. They are history becoming communal memory. And the queen receives her son. There would be tenderness in that meeting, even if no kingdom hung upon it. A child sent away has come home. A mother who entrusted him to the uncertainty of another court now sees him alive, honored, enlarged. But the tenderness cannot remain merely private for more than a breath. This reunion unfolds in the light of gathered nobles, priests, companions, and people. The mother's embrace is also a queen's recognition. The old narrative soon moves to the act that reveals her greatness most clearly. Abdication. On the third day, according to Budge's summary, Makeda gives over the kingdom to her son. She hands to him immense wealth, thousands of fine horses and mares, mules, robes of honor, large quantities of gold and silver. The lavishness of the transfer matters. Kingship is not bestowed here in naked symbolism. It comes with treasury, transport, splendor, and capacity to rule. That scene deserves to be narrated as solemn generosity rather than decline. She does not lose the throne because she has failed. She relinquishes it because the story has reached its appointed form. A great queen, having carried Ethiopia to the threshold of a new age, now steps aside so that the Solomonic line can stand openly. That is not diminishment. It is completion. There is also hardness in what follows. Makeda compels the nobles to swear that no woman shall rule Ethiopia after her, and that only the male offspring of her son David shall reign. Modern ears may hear the severity at once, and they should. The oath is not gentle. It closes one form of sovereignty in order to secure another. Yet within the logic of the Kebra Nagast, the point is clear. Ethiopia must not drift back into uncertainty. The transfer from queenly rule to Solomonic kingship must be made final, public, and unambiguous. There is another layer to Makeda's abdication that deserves attention. She is not portrayed as bewildered by the emergence of a male heir, nor as grudgingly displaced by an inevitable custom. She acts. She arranges. She commands. She transfers. Even in renunciation, she remains queenly. The political order that follows her does not simply happen to her. It is shaped by her deliberate hand. That gives the scene unusual dignity. The founder of the next age is Menelik, but the architect of its transition is still Makeda. That is one reason the later oath lands with such force. It is severe, yes, but it is also self-binding. She does not exempt herself from the principles she imposes. She closes the path behind her own kind of sovereignty, so that the new line cannot easily be contested. In epic terms, that severity functions like a seal. What has been inaugurated must not unravel in the next generation through ambiguity, rivalry, or nostalgia. The gifts, too, are worth lingering over. Numbers in old texts often do more than inventory wealth. They project magnitude. Horses, mares, mules, robes, gold, silver, these things announce logistical power, ceremonial prestige, and the material breadth needed for a kingdom that now claims covenantal centrality. The Solomonic line is not being crowned over poverty and improvisation. It is being established over abundance. There is also something profoundly ceremonial in the way abundance surrounds the transfer. Wealth, animals, robes, music, law, oaths, and sacred presence all converge at once, as if the story refuses to let kingship be founded on a single kind of authority. Blood alone is not enough. Treasure alone is not enough. Public celebration alone is not enough. Even the ark alone is not enough if no polity forms around it. The scene gathers every register: maternal, royal, priestly, legal, military, and liturgical, so that Menelik's reign appears complete from its first great public moment. It is also important that the enthronement is not narrated as private revelation made public only by decree. It becomes public through sensation. People hear it, see it, dance it, swear to it, and carry it home in memory. That is how national myth hardens into historical feeling. It enters not just law, but festival, not just doctrine, but sound. This is why the ceremony feels crowded in the best sense. Everything gathers because everything must. The new king needs ancestry, oath, treasure, liturgy, acclaim, and Dion all at once, so that no rival story can later say Ethiopia received only half a kingdom. So, the oath becomes constitutional myth. It tells the future who may reign. It binds nobility to memory. It turns personal lineage into national law. This is exactly why scholars read the Kebra Nagast as political ideology as well as sacred epic. Written in gaze in its surviving medieval form, the text gave later Ethiopian monarchy a providential ancestry and a legitimizing structure powerful enough to outlive centuries. The story is not content with romance, miracle, and coronation alone. It wants institutions underwritten by heaven. Then comes proclamation. The son who had been anointed in Jerusalem under the name David now stands publicly declared in Ethiopia. Budge's summary surrounds the moment with jubilee trumpets, music, singing, dancing, games of every kind. This is not a hidden enthronement among a few officials. It is national festival. Sound itself is recruited to make kingship memorable. The entire sensory life of the kingdom bends toward acknowledgement. One can hear it if one slows down enough. Trumpets rising over gathered crowds. Voices answering. Feet beating the earth in dance. Children lifted to see. Old men weeping, because they sense they are watching the beginning of an age that will outlast them. And at the center, Bena Lechem, Menyelech, David, son of Solomon, son of Makeda, bearer of Vion, receives not merely a crown, but a role in sacred memory that no later Ethiopian monarch would lightly relinquish. The ark's presence intensifies everything. A king can be crowned by lineage alone. He can be acclaimed by nobles alone. He can be armed by wealth alone. But to be enthroned in the neighborhood of Vion is to reign under a different magnitude of claim. Now Ethiopia is not simply ruled by a king descended from Solomon. It is ruled by that king in the presence of the object that the story dares to call the dwelling sign of God's favor. That is why the coronation matters beyond ceremony. It joins dynasty to sanctuary. It joins political succession to sacred relocation. It tells the audience that the South has become not merely another kingdom blessed by memory of Israel, but the living continuation of Israel's protected glory. The text even moves toward inscription and memorialization. Budge's summary notes that the law of the kingdom and the Ethiopian creed were written and placed as perpetual witness. Whether read literally or as ideological symbolism, the impulse is plain. This new order must be recorded, fixed, and made durable. Memory becomes text. Text becomes legitimacy. Then, because epics rarely permit newly founded kings to rest in static triumph, the narrative drives Menyelech outward in war. Soon after establishing the kingdom, he campaigns west, south, and east with the ark at the head of his forces. No enemy conquers him. Whole districts fall. The language is severe, even ruthless. This is sacred kingship in its expansive ancient form, where victory validates divine favor, and conquest displays the potency of the covenantal sign born into battle. A modern narrator should neither flatten nor romanticize this. The old epic imagines empire under sanctuary. Its victories are part of its theology. The same Jane who moved above the earth on the southward road now leads armies. Presence becomes power. Inheritance becomes expansion. The unconquered king proves that the transfer was no empty legend, but a living source of national force. Yet even if one leaves aside the warfare, the emotional center of this section remains the queen's surrender of power. That is the human image that lingers. A mother sees her son return greater than when he departed. A ruler sees the next order of history standing before her. A woman who has carried crown and kingdom yields both without bitterness because the promise has ripened. There is grandeur in that kind of relinquishment that battle can never surpass. And the people watching all this now understand themselves differently. They are no longer merely subjects of a wise queen who once visited Jerusalem. They are the people of the Son of Solomon. They are the guardians of Zion. They are the nation in which the old glory has come to dwell. That transformation of collective self-understanding may be the deepest achievement of the Kebra Nagast. It does not simply tell Ethiopians that their rulers have an illustrious ancestor. It tells them their land has become sacred center, their monarchy divinely threaded into biblical history, and their future anchored in a transfer no foreign empire can easily dismiss. That is why the story endured. Not because it was modest, because it was immense. It gave Ethiopia a past that reached into Solomon, a cultic prestige that reached into the Holy of Holies, and a political theology capable of binding throne, church, and nation together across centuries. Scholars may rightly stress its medieval composition and ideological purpose, yet that scholarly caution does not erase the emotional genius of the narrative itself. It knew how to make legitimacy unforgettable. One further beauty of the enthronement lies in how it resolves every major tension the story has carried since Makeda first rode north. Wisdom sought in Jerusalem returns as kingship in Ethiopia. A hidden child becomes a public dynasty. A mother's guarded memory becomes a nation's formal history. A road once traveled in curiosity is answered by a road traveled in fulfillment. Even the ring's old silence is, in a sense, completed here, because the proof it once offered privately has become a kingdom everyone can see. That completion gives the ending of this movement such satisfying force. Nothing important has been abandoned. The Queen's dignity remains. Solomon's blood remains. Tion remains. The people remain. Yet all of them now stand arranged in a new order, and Ethiopia is taught to call that order blessed by generations yet to come. So let the scene settle in the mind one last time. The road ends. The mother receives. The nobles swear. The trumpets sound. The sun is crowned. The ark stands near. And an entire civilization is invited to believe that what once shone in Jerusalem now burns, guarded, and terrible in Ethiopia. That is the throne given over, not in weakness, not in accident, but in fulfillment. Once a kingdom has crowned the heir, sworn the oath, received the ark, and sounded its trumpets, the old epic refuses to leave that kingdom at rest. That is one of the most revealing instincts in the Kebra Nagast. It does not treat enthronement as a sufficient proof of election. Election must move. Election must conquer. Election must show itself capable of remaking the world around it. So the newly settled reign of Menelik, also called David, does not remain in ceremonial stillness. The moment the throne is secured and Veon stands within Ethiopian keeping, motion begins again. The story that has already carried queen, son, ark, and dynasty across deserts and kingdoms now turns outward from Ethiopia itself, asking a harder question. What does a chosen kingdom do once it believes holiness now dwells in its midst? The answer, in the imagination of the book, is stark. It marches. Budge's summary says that soon after Menelik established his kingdom, he set out to wage war against his enemies with the Ark of the Covenant at the head of his forces. He moved west, south, and east. The geography swells into epic breadth. Nubia, Egypt, Arabia, lands stretching toward India. This is not the language of defensive skirmish alone. It is the language of sacred expansion, of a monarchy proving itself by victorious range. One must narrate that carefully. The old text does not imagine these campaigns as morally ambiguous exercises in ordinary statecraft. It imagines them as demonstrations. Demonstrations that the Ark has not come to Ethiopia as a mute relic. Demonstrations that divine favor did not merely relocate. It armed. Demonstrations that the son of Solomon is no ceremonial figure draped in borrowed legitimacy, but a ruler beneath whose standard enemies break. So picture the beginning of those campaigns. The court has scarcely settled from coronation music. The oath of succession still echoes in noble memory. The transfer of wealth from Makeda to her son is still recent enough to feel warm in the hand. And already, the new king is moving beyond the palace. That speed tells us something profound about the political imagination of the work. A sacred dynasty that waits too long risks looking ornamental. A sacred dynasty that wins looks inevitable. And at the very front of its movement is Veon. That detail changes everything. A normal army carries banners, weapons, supply animals, elite guards, and the authority of the crown. This army carries the sign the narrative has already taught us to treat as the highest concentration of divine nearness on earth. In biblical memory, the ark had been carried in wilderness, set at the heart of Israel's worship, and even brought into battle. Britannica's overview of the ark emphasizes that it housed the tablets of the law, rested in the Holy of Holies, and had long been tied to Israel's most sacred geography and martial memory. So, When the Kebra Nagast places it at the head of Menelek's campaigns, it is not inventing a random decoration for battle. It is seizing one of the most potent sacred symbols in biblical tradition and turning it into Ethiopia's war-fronted legitimacy. Imagine what that would mean inside the story's own emotional world. The soldiers do not merely march behind a king, they march behind presence. The ground in front of them is not merely a field to be crossed, it is a field preceded by judgment. The enemies they face are not simply rival peoples. They are peoples standing in the path of a kingdom convinced that heaven has chosen its center. No wonder the victories in the summary are total in tone. The ark goes before the army. The Ethiopians prevail. Whoever attacks is conquered. Districts are laid waste. The language is severe. Because ancient sacred empire is severe, a modern narrator should not pretend otherwise. There is beauty in the grandeur of the epic, but there is hardness in its theology of conquest. The chosen kingdom is not imagined as a merely contemplative sanctuary state. It is imagined as a force before which surrounding powers fall. And that force is made more terrible, not less, by the fact that Biyon leads it. One can almost see the order of battle the text wants us to imagine. First, the holy sign, then the king, then the ranks of men carrying Ethiopian destiny outward. First, liturgy, then kingship, then arms. The sequencing matters. It says that violence, in this narrative, is not autonomous. It is subordinated to presence, justified by covenantal order, enclosed within the logic of transfer. Whether a modern reader accepts that logic is another question, but the epic itself leaves no doubt. Victory comes because holiness walks first. There is an old and unsettling power in that image. The ark had once moved ahead of Israel in the wilderness. Now, in Ethiopian imagination, it moves ahead of the son of Solomon in another land. That parallel is not accidental. The Kebra Nagast wants Ethiopia to inherit not fragments of Israel's memory, but Israel's pattern of chosenness. Wilderness, kingship, ark, battle, law, divine favor. These must all appear again in a new geography if the claim is to be complete. That is why the campaigns matter beyond military spectacle. They are ritual confirmation of national identity. And what of Makeda during this time? The full text and summary preserve an intriguing note. She remains alive for many years after she gives the kingdom to her son, and one summary even places her accompanying him in the early wars. That is a striking image. The queen who once rode north for wisdom now rides in the aftermath of fulfillment, not as reigning monarch, but as witness to the expansion of the order she made possible. She is no discarded predecessor. She is enduring foundation. This matters for the emotional texture of the story. Makeda does not vanish the moment Menelek is crowned. She remains within the horizon of Ethiopian greatness. That continuity softens the transition even as the oath hardens it. A mother yields the throne, yet still beholds the empire of her son. A queen relinquishes sovereignty, yet still inhabits the unfolding success of the line she secured. That is not defeat. It is dynastic afterlife. Meanwhile, inside Ethiopia, law is settling. The Kebra Nagast says more than that the people rejoice or that enemies are crushed. It says a law was made for the land. No man of any other seed should reign, but only the... That sentence is among the most politically important in the whole work. It turns story into constitution. It turns the romance of Solomon and Makeda, the journey of Menelek, and the transfer of the ark into an enduring rule of legitimacy. The kingdom is therefore being established on two fronts at once. Outwardly, by conquest. Inwardly, by law. That dual structure is essential. A dynasty that only conquers may blaze and vanish. a dynasty that only legislates may claim but never compel belief. The Kebra Nagast wants both. It wants a house that wins in war and endures in principle. It wants the sword and the genealogy bound together under the same sacred sign. That is also why the text so loves to speak of Ethiopia in elevated terms after the transfer. The city of Ethiopia becomes, in one striking expression from the full text, as the city of God. The comparison is not small. Jerusalem had once held the holiness of the Ark within the temple. Now Ethiopia, through possession of Kion, is described in language that lifts it toward sacred urban status. The whole land bends toward typology. Picture the consequence of such a phrase. A people once hearing of Jerusalem as distant center can now hear their own city named in corresponding grandeur. A monarchy, once one among many, can now be imagined as sheltering the earthly dwelling of glory. A local court becomes a cosmic stage. This is how national epics alter imagination. They do not merely provide ancestors, they rename space. And if space is renamed, then every campaign launched from that space becomes more than war. It becomes radiating sanctity, radiating judgment, radiating kingship. No wonder the text speaks in superlatives when discussing the Ethiopian king. Budge's summary says the work was written to prove that the king of Ethiopia is more exalted and honorable than any other king on earth because of the glory and greatness of the heavenly Zion. There is no embarrassment in the claim. The epic is not shy. It is built to enthrone Ethiopia above all rivals in sacred rank. The wars thus function as one proof among several. If the Ark remained merely hidden in a shrine, an outsider might dismiss the transfer as pious myth. But if the Ark moves before armies and victory follows, then the legend gathers visible consequence. At least that is the internal logic of the narrative. Victory is evidence. Expansion is evidence. Enduring rule is evidence. The unconquered king is evidence. There is another reason the campaigns matter in the emotional logic of the epic. The Ark had already proven its power in flight, carrying the company away from Solomon with supernatural speed. But escape alone could still be read as a single miracle tied to a single crisis. War multiplies the proof. Once Tion stands at the head of repeated victories, the miracle ceases to look accidental. It becomes policy written in battle. The people can say not merely, "She saved us once, but she goes before us still." This would have changed the imagination of every rank in the kingdom. Nobles would see succession confirmed. Priests would see worship vindicated. Soldiers would see courage charged with metaphysical weight. Ordinary subjects, hearing of distant peoples brought low, would come to think of Ethiopia not only as blessed, but as protected by an active and moving holiness. Such confidence is exactly what dynastic literature seeks to create. Not admiration alone, but inevitability. And inevitability is the right word. A king who inherits Solomon's blood might still be challenged. A king who inherits Solomon's blood, carries Eon, receives his mother's law, and cannot be defeated, becomes something much more difficult to resist. He begins to look less like a fortunate monarch than like the visible center of a providential design already unfolding faster than rival kingdoms can answer. There is a final, quieter victory in these campaigns as well. As the king moves outward, the lore of Davidic succession moves inward. Every triumph abroad gives the domestic order more solidity at home. The farther the armies go, the less imaginable it becomes that Ethiopia might return to older uncertainties. The world outside sees a conquering dynasty. The world inside learns to believe permanence. That is how sacred monarchy secures itself, by persuading enemies through force and persuading its own people through repeated signs that history has already made its choice. Even the memory of Solomon is transformed here. In Jerusalem, he had become the grieving king who could not recover what was lost. In Ethiopia, his line becomes active again through the son who wins. The father's faded authority is answered by the son's advancing authority. That contrast would have made Menelek's victories feel like more than personal triumph. They would feel like restoration, as if Davidic kingship itself had found a second and more durable stage in the south. And because the campaigns follow so soon after coronation, they make one final claim unmistakable. Ethiopia has not merely received a story from Jerusalem, it has received momentum. The glory that came south does not sit still. It advances, organizes, judges, and compels the age around it. The age had begun in earnest, and yet, beneath the clangor of conquest, another quieter transformation continues. A generation is being taught what it means to live under a sacral monarchy. Children grow up, not simply hearing that their king is powerful, but that his power descends from Solomon and stands in the neighborhood of Zion. Priests and nobles learn that loyalty is no longer merely civic, it is covenantal. Enemies are not merely neighboring threats. They become foils against which election displays itself. That is how epics harden into governing consciousness. The soldier on campaign, the noble at court, the worshiper in ceremony, the child hearing the old tales, each receives the same lesson in a different key. Ethiopia is no longer peripheral to sacred history. It has become its guarded continuation. That belief gives the whole 10th movement of the story its intensity. The throne is not a chair now. It is an advancing axis. The Ark is not an inherited treasure now. It is a standard of world order. The sun is not merely returned now. He is proving, mile by mile and conquest by conquest, that return was only the beginning. And Makeda, still living beyond her abdication, can watch what she could not have fully imagined when she first rode north. Wisdom has come back armed, enthroned, and accompanied by a glory fierce enough to make Ethiopia believe it has become the new dwelling of God. There comes a point in the Kebra Nagast when simple storytelling no longer seems large enough for what the book wants to claim. The queen has journeyed. The son has been born. The father has recognized. The ark has departed Jerusalem. Solomon has lamented. Ethiopia has received, crowned, marched, conquered. At that point, a lesser epic might stop. This one does not. Instead, it widens its voice. It begins to speak not only as story, but as proclamation. The narrative world swells into theology, typology, and universal argument. It is no longer content to say merely that Ethiopia possesses a famous object and a Davidic king. It wants to explain why. That possession and that kingship reorder the meaning of history itself. Budge's summary makes the ambition plain. The book was written to prove that the king of Ethiopia is more exalted and honorable than any other king upon earth because of the glory and greatness of the heavenly Zion. That sentence is the axis around which the later chapters turn. It is not a quiet, patriotic flourish, it is the grand thesis. Think about how daring that is. Not one among great kings, not admirable in a regional sense, not merely ancient, noble, or biblically connected, more exalted than any other king on earth. Why? Not because of numbers alone, not because of wealth alone, not because of battlefield success alone, because of Zion. Because the heavenly Zion, the sign of divine nearness, the glory once housed in the temple, now rests in Ethiopia. This is how the Kebra Nagast transforms monarchy into sacramental prestige. The Ethiopian king is not greatest only because he descends from Solomon. Descent would matter, but it would not be enough. He is greatest because lineage and presence have met. Blood and ark, seed of David and heavenly Zion, dynasty and dwelling place. That double concentration of authority is what makes the book so politically brilliant. It does not rely on genealogy without cult. It does not rely on cult without law. It does not rely on law without miracle. It gathers them all and then lifts the resulting monarchy above the rest of the earth. There is another theological beauty in the later movement of the book. It keeps refusing to separate heaven's signs from earth's institutions. Modern readers often divide religion and politics into distinct chambers, but the Kebra Nagast writes as though such a division would mutilate reality. If God has truly allowed Vion to dwell in Ethiopia, then liturgy, monarchy, law, interpretation, and collective identity must all bend around that fact. Sacred presence is not a private consolation. It is a principle of civil order. That is why the later chapters sound so confident when they rise from story into proclamation. They are not merely adding sermons onto an adventure. They are naming what the adventure was always meant to establish. The Ark's transfer justifies the dynasty. The dynasty safeguards the Ark. The Ark interprets the kingdom. The kingdom magnifies the Ark. Each confirms the other, until Ethiopia appears less like a nation among nations and more like a chosen vessel of continuity. One can feel this most strongly in the way the text handles memory of Israel. Ethiopia does not erase Israel. It receives and extends Israel's holy charge. The old sanctuary patterns remain meaningful. The old symbols continue to radiate significance. Yet the center of gravity shifts. Jerusalem becomes origin and loss. Ethiopia becomes custody and continuation. That delicate balance allows the epic to claim succession without pretending that the biblical past never mattered. In fact, the biblical past matters so much that Ethiopia must inherit it in order for history to remain coherent. This is also where the Christian typologies perform their deepest work. By linking ark and tabernacle imagery to Mary and Christ, the book prevents the Ethiopian claim from looking like nostalgia for a superseded age. The old signs are not antiquities to be admired from a distance. They are mysteries whose fullest sense is now visible in Christian light. Ethiopia, therefore, does not stand guarding abandoned furniture from a dead covenant. It stands guarding symbols whose meanings bloom forward into incarnation, cross, and final judgment. That move is astonishingly sophisticated. It allows the epic to be fiercely Old Testament in texture, while unmistakably Christian in final horizon. It explains why the church that cherished the story could be deeply attached to ark symbolism without imagining itself trapped before the gospel. Instead, the old and the new are folded together, and John becomes a kind of meeting place between them. There is also a devotional consequence to this theology. If the ark remains in Ethiopia until the end, then Ethiopian worship is never merely local in scope. Every prayer uttered near Zion carries eschatological nearness. The faithful are not simply remembering what God once did. They are standing beside what God still intends to unveil fully in the last days. That gives liturgy a charged patience. Worship becomes waiting in the company of glory. This helps explain why the language of exaltation does not collapse into simple royal vanity. The king is elevated, yes, but always because he stands nearest an entrusted mystery greater than himself. The book's strongest statements about monarchy are therefore also statements of obligation. To reign near Tion is to rule under scrutiny. The king's greatness is derivative, radiant, and conditional upon fidelity to the sacred charge that makes him great at all. And fidelity, in this worldview, means more than personal morality. It means maintaining the alignment of land, law, cult, and lineage. It means seeing Ethiopia not as private possession, but as covenantal station. It means understanding that the Ark's presence judges the king no less than it glorifies him. This is why the later chapters feel less like appendix than elevation. The story climbs until throne, sanctuary, prophecy, and final hope all stand on one height together. Ethiopia is not merely where the tale happens. It becomes where sacred history is said to wait, watch, and shine. Such language is excessive only if the book's purpose is forgotten. Its purpose is to make Ethiopia appear not peripheral to redemption, but luminously central within it. And once that centrality is declared, every rival crown is forced to appear, derivative, however mighty it may look, in silver, stone, horses, law, armies, or learned books, on earth. Yet the later movement goes even further. It begins to interpret the sacred symbols themselves. The ark, the tabernacle, the rod of Aaron, the brazen serpent, the manna, the old figures of Israel's scriptural memory, these are drawn into a Christian typological world. The book links them to Christ, to the Virgin Mary, to redemption, to the cross. In other words, Ethiopia's possession of Vion is not presented as a dusty attachment to obsolete ritual. It is woven into Christian salvation history. Budge's summary notes that the later chapters elaborate exactly these typological readings, showing how Old Testament symbols prefigure Christ and Mary. That expansion matters enormously. Without it, the Kebra Nagast might have remained only a nationalist tale of sacred theft and royal succession. With it, the book becomes something much larger, a claim that Ethiopia stands at the meeting point of Israelite inheritance and Christian fulfillment. The Old Covenant is not merely preserved there, it is interpreted there, guarded there, recast there as part of the divine drama, culminating in Christ. One of the boldest moves in this tradition is the way the tabernacle becomes linked to the Virgin Mary. That comparison is not arbitrary poetry. It arises from the logic of dwelling. The ark held the tablets of the law. Mary bore the Word incarnate. The tabernacle sheltered divine sign. Mary sheltered divine life. The typology lets the old holy container and the Christian Holy Mother illuminate each other. And once such a reading is allowed, Ethiopia's guardianship of Yeon no longer looks like a merely antiquarian claim. It becomes charged with Marian resonance, Christological significance, and sacred continuity beyond the temple itself. This helps explain why the book survived so powerfully within Ethiopian Christian culture. Britannica notes the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church's strong emphasis on the Hebrew Bible, the centrality of ark symbolism in every church, the use of Ge'ez liturgy, and the persistence of ritual forms in which Old Testament patterns remain unusually vivid. In such a religious world, a text that binds ark, Mary, Davidic kingship, and Christian salvation into one story would not feel strange. It would feel like a grand unveiling of what the land already sensed itself to be. The later Kebra Nagast is therefore not embarrassed by sacred layering. Israel remains. Christ enters. Mary shines. Ethiopia inherits. The king rules. Yon abides. That layering is one of the secrets of the book's endurance. It can speak to royal ideology, to liturgical imagination, to biblical memory, and to Christian devotion all at once. And there is another crucial late claim. The ark's stay in Ethiopia is not temporary in an ordinary historical sense. Budge's summary says the chariot of Zion would remain in Ethiopia until the second coming of Christ, and only then would the tabernacle of the law return to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. That is an extraordinary eschatological arrangement. Ethiopia becomes the long stewardship of sacred presence across the ages, while Jerusalem awaits a future restoration at the very end of time. This is not merely a statement about location. It is a statement about ages. The ark does not simply relocate from one kingdom to another for a season. It enters a vast timetable. Ethiopia becomes the keeper of an interval stretching from ancient transfer to final consummation. That grants the Ethiopian monarchy and church an almost unbearable dignity in the imagination of the text. They are not custodians for a year, a reign, or a dynasty only. They become custodians across salvation history. Picture what that means in narrative emotion. Every liturgy offered near the ark is no longer only contemporary devotion. It is participation in an entrusted waiting. Every king of the Davidic line rules not merely over a current population. He rules as steward of something history has not yet finished using. Every generation becomes a link in a chain holding Yon until the last unveiling. That is why the book's exaltation of Ethiopia is so much more than local pride. It is cosmic patience given national form. There is also a subtle political masterstroke in the way the text pairs Ethiopia with Rome in the later theological horizon. Budge's summary refers to the idea of the two horns of power, the king of Ethiopia and the king of Rome. The cross belongs to Rome. Yeon remains in Ethiopia. The pairing is striking. One Christian imperium shelters one central sign. The other shelters another. This gives Ethiopia a place not beneath the great Christian powers of the world, but alongside them in sacred polarity. Again, the genius is clear. Ethiopia is not narrated as an isolated holy curiosity at the edge of civilization. It is narrated as one half of a providential arrangement. Rome has one glory. Ethiopia has another. The world of Christian kingship is thus not complete without the Ethiopian side. This is how a medieval epic writes its way into universal history. It refuses marginality. It composes centrality. It does not ask whether outsiders will agree. It simply speaks as if the matter is settled in heaven, and the king within that arrangement becomes almost more than king. Not divine, certainly. The book still operates inside Christian confession, but he becomes the preeminent earthly bearer of a specific entrusted glory. He reigns in the shadow and brilliance of Veon. He is exalted because of what he guards. A throne near heavenly Zion becomes greater than crowns, unaccompanied by such nearness. That logic may sound strange to modern political ears, yet it is internally rigorous. If divine presence is the measure, then prestige without presence is inferior, however wealthy or militarily advanced it may be. And that thought cuts deeper than medieval propaganda alone. It asks a broader religious question. What makes a kingdom truly great? Gold? Walls? Books? Lineage? Or nearness to the dwelling of God? The Kebra Nagast answers without hesitation. Nearness. Everything else is secondary. That is why the later chapters can pivot so naturally from royal exaltation to typological meditation. The king matters because Yeon matters. Veon matters because divine presence matters. Divine presence matters because all history bends toward Christ, and Christ matters because the old signs were always waiting to be fulfilled. Thus, the epic's final theology closes the circle. The ark that once traveled in wilderness and stood in Solomon's temple now lives in a Christianized Ethiopian horizon under Davidic kingship, while pointing beyond itself toward incarnation and final consummation. It is an audacious synthesis, a national epic, a royal manifesto, a Marian typology, a Christological reading of Israel's sacred furniture, an eschatological geography, all of it bound together in one gloriously unembarrassed claim. The heavenly Zion abides in Ethiopia, and because she abides there, no earthly king stands higher than the king who reigns beneath her light. Every great epic eventually reaches the point where narrative hardens into destiny. The lovers or rulers or heroes who once moved through ordinary time begin to stand inside prophetic time. Their actions no longer belong only to the past. They begin to govern the future. That is exactly how the Kebra Nagast ends its work. It refuses to leave Veon resting in Ethiopia as a beautiful finished fact. Instead, it stretches the meaning of that resting all the way to the edge of the world. The later tradition, summarized by Budge, says the tabernacle of the law will remain in Ethiopia until the second coming of Christ, and that only at that last unveiling will it return to Mount Zion in Jerusalem. So the book closes not with simple possession, but with stewardship under apocalyptic horizon. That final horizon changes the emotional color of everything behind it. Now, the journey of Makeda was not only a queen's quest. The birth of Benediction was not only a dynastic miracle. The recognition by Solomon was not only a father's joy. The removal of the ark was not only a transgressive sacred transfer. The coronation in Ethiopia was not only the rise of a new monarchy. All of it becomes preparation for a long guardianship measured against the end of time. This is part of the grandeur of the text. It does not think small, and because it does not think small, it can absorb even later political dreams and apocalyptic anxieties into its closing movement. Budge's summary notes the final chapter's grim prophetic material about future rulers of Rome and Ethiopia meeting in Jerusalem, exchanging titles, and participating in a violent judgmental horizon. Modern readers will feel the harshness and sectarian strain in those lines immediately, and they should. The close of the Kebra Nagast is not gentle universalism. It is medieval sacred history, pressing toward a final sorting of powers and peoples. That severity should not be hidden. Ancient and medieval religious epics often carry splendors and cruelties in the same vessel. They bless one people and threaten another. They console by dividing history into the faithful and the judged. The Kebra Nagast is no exception. Its ending bears the marks of apocalyptic confidence sharpened into polemic. Yet even that severity tells us something important about the scale of the book's ambition. This is not a court entertainment. It is a text trying to explain where authority truly lies in the world, which kingdoms stand nearest divine favor, and how present rule connects to last things. In other words, it is not merely telling Ethiopia who it was. It is telling Ethiopia who it would remain until history ends. That helps explain why modern scholarship speaks of the Kebra Nagast as politico-religious epic, medieval mythology, and a work crafted to legitimize Solomonic rule after the rise of a new dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries. Wikipedia's overview is very direct on this point. In its surviving Gedges form, the text is a 14th century national epic whose stories are not accepted by modern historians as literal history, but are widely understood as serving the ideological needs of Solomonic power. That scholarly caution matters. It should be spoken plainly. The Kebra Nagast is not a neutral chronicle in the modern sense. It is a magnificent act of meaning-making. It gathers biblical memory, oral tradition, dynastic need, church imagination, and sacred geography, then forges them into a narrative strong enough to crown kings, and the proof of its power is simple. It worked. For centuries, the Solomonic line ruled Ethiopia beneath the shadow of this claim. The story did not remain trapped in parchment. It entered coronations. It entered public memory. It entered church consciousness. It entered the way a people imagine themselves, before God and before the world. There is another way to understand the lasting power of the story. It gave shape to absence. The historical arc's fate is unknown in mainstream scholarship, as Britannica notes, and that very uncertainty leaves immense imaginative space. Into that space, the Kebra Nagast pours a complete answer. The ark is not missing, only hidden. Not vanished, only transferred. Not destroyed, only entrusted. That is a profoundly satisfying narrative move, because it converts one of biblical history's great silences into Ethiopian guardianship. And once that answer exists, it can do work far beyond curiosity. It can console a people under threat. It can ennoble worship. It can make remote scriptures feel geographically intimate. It can tell emperors that their authority is anchored deeper than military fortune. It can tell priests that their liturgy participates in a custody older than their own language. It can tell ordinary believers that the great drama of Israel did not end in a void, but continued in a land they can actually walk upon. That is why the legend belongs not only to the palace, but to processions, feast days, church teaching, and collective imagination. Stories survive best when they explain both the heights and wounds of a people. The Kebra Nagast did that. It gave Ethiopia exaltation, but it also gave Ethiopia burden. To keep Tion is to be responsible for an entrusted fire. The story does not merely flatter the nation, it loads the nation with sacred duty. Even its medieval polemics reveal that burden in distorted form. The text's harder judgments and apocalyptic enemies show how seriously it took the drama of election. If Ethiopia had truly received the glory, then history itself must eventually reveal who honored and who resisted that transfer. We need not endorse those harsh conclusions to understand the emotional machinery behind them. A people who think they guard the center of sacred history will naturally imagine the end of history unveiling that guardianship before the world. And so the legend lives in a double register. To outsiders, it can look extravagant. To insiders, it can feel clarifying. To scholars, it is a monumental synthesis of ideology and devotion. To believers, it can remain a living account of providence. The gap between those readings is not a flaw. It is part of what makes the book historically fascinating and spiritually potent. There is also something deeply narrative in the way the book keeps Ethiopia and Jerusalem joined even while separating them. The ark departs one city and rests in another, yet the story never allows either place to disappear. Jerusalem remains the place of origin, memory, and promised final unveiling. Ethiopia becomes the place of custody, continuation, and present glory. The bond between them is stretched, wounded, and transformed, but not broken. That tension gives the legend unusual emotional durability. It is a story of transfer that still remembers where it came from. For that reason, the final promise of return at the end of time matters enormously. It prevents Ethiopia's custody from becoming mere possession. To keep Theon is not to own her in a modern sense. It is to guard her until the appointed hour. Stewardship, not crude possession, is the highest form of the claim. And perhaps that is the last reason the book remains unforgettable. It closes not by shrinking mystery into certainty, but by enlarging certainty into mystery. The ark is said to be in Ethiopia, yes, yet it is also hidden, reserved, deferred, surrounded by liturgy and future promise. The claim satisfies and withholds at once. People are told where glory rests, but not in a way that makes glory ordinary. That tension between nearness and concealment is one of the oldest engines of enduring sacred tradition. That is also why the story remains adaptable. It can be preached, sung, debated, historicized, doubted, revered, and still continue exerting force. Few texts survive so many different kinds of reading unless they touch something very deep indeed. Perhaps that is the deepest ending of all. The book leaves a kingdom looking outward toward apocalypse and inward toward worship at the same time. It teaches Ethiopia to wait, to remember, to guard, and to believe that hidden glory can still define visible history. That belief is the ember the Kebra Nagast refuses ever to let cool. That is why a concluding voiceover must not end only in skepticism. however necessary skepticism may be. To say this is medieval political theology is true, but it is not enough. One must also ask why this particular political theology endured so deeply. Part of the answer lies in Ethiopian Christianity itself. Britannica notes how strongly the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church retained Old Testament emphasis, Gehez scripture, and liturgy, the centrality of ark symbolism in every church, and a religious culture in which biblical antiquity never felt fully severed from present worship. In such a world, the claim that the true Vion rests in Ethiopia is not an alien fantasy. It resonates with the structure of devotion already in place. The ark, after all, was never a trivial object in biblical tradition. Britannica's article on the ark emphasizes that it housed the tablets of the law, rested in the Holy of Holies, and served as one of the most charged symbols of covenantal presence in Judaism and Christianity. To claim it for Ethiopia was therefore to claim not a souvenir, but a center of religious prestige almost beyond comparison. That is why the legend could do such enormous work. It gave Ethiopia a royal genealogy rooted in Solomon. It gave Ethiopia a sacred object greater than any crown jewel. It gave Ethiopia a geography capable of rivaling Jerusalem in holiness. It gave Ethiopia a role in Christian times stretching from ancient Israel to the Second Coming. And it gave the monarchy a warrant that was not merely political but cosmic. Very few narratives can do all of that at once. The Kebra Nagast did, which is why it cannot be reduced either to mere propaganda or to simple history. It is more potent and more complicated. It is propaganda elevated by poetry, history transfigured by desire, scripture refracted through national need, myth acting with the force of law. And if one wants a final image for what the book achieved, perhaps it is this. A queen rides north, seeking wisdom. A king gives a ring. A sun grows in the south. A city recognizes a face. A priest steals the ark. A father weeps. A mother abdicates. A dynasty rises. An empire marches. A church remembers. A people keep telling the story until it becomes part of the architecture of their world. That is legacy. Not simply survival of a text, survival of a vision. A vision in which Ethiopia is not marginal, not secondary, not derivative, but chosen to bear a dangerous glory until the end. The final prayerfulness of the tradition deepens this further. The full text closes in tones of blessing and thanksgiving, praising God for light, for the tabernacle of the law, for the sacred order now seen. That benedictory ending matters. After all the schemes, wars, transfers, and claims, the book finally wants to stand in gratitude before Providence. The voice of triumph yields, at least for a moment, to the voice of praise. And perhaps that is the most revealing last gesture of all. The Kebra Nagast does not think it has invented a national myth. It thinks it has uncovered a divine arrangement. It does not end as though it has persuaded by rhetoric alone. It ends as though it has testified. That conviction is the secret of its authority. Texts that merely flatter can be forgotten. Texts that seem to reveal destiny become scripture-like in a culture's memory, even when they are not scripture. So the book leaves us with a paradox. Modern scholarship can stand outside it and identify composition, agenda, legend, synthesis, and medieval ideology. Inside Ethiopian sacred memory, however, the tale can still breathe as witness, inheritance, and holy rumor carried by generations of devotion. Both truths matter. The historian must not surrender evidence. The listener must not fail to hear why the story mattered. And if one holds both together, the ending becomes richer rather than poorer. We see a medieval epic made for kings, We also see why ordinary believers, priests, nobles, and later rulers could live inside its world, because it answered a hunger larger than politics. It answered the hunger to know that one's land had not been overlooked by God, that one's monarchy was not an accident, that one's liturgy touched ancient fire, that one's suffering and endurance belonged within biblical time, that one's future extended beyond empires into apocalypse and restoration. This is why the story could endure through monarchy, church, conquest, translation, scholarship, and modern doubt. It offered Ethiopia not only a past, but a destiny guarded by Eon, until the last return, until the day when, according to the book's own daring promise, the glory that journeyed south will at last be unveiled again before the whole world. And until then, the old epic teaches its hearers to imagine the Ark not as lost, but as waiting hidden in sacred custody, enthroned in memory, and still burning at the center of a kingdom that learned to call itself chosen.